Tonight, we're going to explore a thought that is both ancient and strangely intimate, a question rooted not only in geology and history, but in imagination itself. Imagine a world before maps needed borders, before oceans cut the earth into familiar shapes, before names like Africa, Europe, or the Americas meant anything at all. Imagine standing on land that does not end in a coastline after a few days of walking, but continues, quietly and patiently, in every direction. One vast surface, stitched together by stone instead of water. A world that existed long before human memory, yet still lives beneath our feet in fragments. What if the first civilization lived on Pangaea, not as a metaphor, not as a myth, at least not yet, but as a genuine possibility to consider, gently and carefully without rushing toward conclusions? What if the earliest organized human culture, the first shared traditions, the first long memories, took shape on a planet where all the continents were joined as one? A single landmass, a single continuous world. It's an idea that feels almost too large at first, like trying to hold the entire globe in your hands. But tonight, we're not here to prove or disprove it. We're here to explore what it would mean, how such a world might shape people, movement, stories, survival, and the quiet habits of daily life. We're here to let the question unfold slowly, layer by layer, the way the Earth itself once did. Before we go any further, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it late evening or very early morning? Is the world outside your window still or moving? Somewhere on this planet, the sun is rising over land that was once pressed against another continent far away. Somewhere else, it's setting. All of us, separated by oceans now, sharing a moment of attention across drifting ground. If you find this kind of exploration soothing, or if you enjoy letting science and imagination meet in a quieter space, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this small corner of calm reach others who might be looking for something gentle to listen to as the day winds down. But for now, there's nothing you need to do at all. Just listen. Let's begin by grounding ourselves in what Pangaea actually was, not as a dramatic supercontinent from textbooks, but as a long-lived phase of Earth's story. Pangaea wasn't a brief accident. It existed roughly between 335 and 175 million years ago, forming slowly as earlier landmasses collided and fused together. For tens of millions of years, Earth's land was largely unified, surrounded by a vast global ocean called Panthalassa. From space, if space had eyes back then, the planet would have looked unfamiliar but whole, like a puzzle assembled instead of scattered. Now, it's important to say something clearly and early. Modern humans did not exist during the time of Pangaea. Anatomically, modern Homo sapiens appeared only about 300,000 years ago, long after the supercontinent had broken apart. Dinosaurs roamed Pangaea. Early mammals lived in its shadows. Forests, deserts, and inland seas came and went. But humans, as we know them, arrived much later. So why ask this question at all? Because Earth's surface has memory. Because continents drift slowly, but not so slowly that nothing remains connected. Because fragments of Pangaea persisted long after its official breakup. Land bridges formed and vanished. Climate patterns lingered. Geological structures carried echoes of older arrangements. And because early human civilization itself is still full of unanswered questions, gaps, and silences where stories should be. The earliest known civilizations, places like Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, early China, and ancient Egypt, appear suddenly in the archaeological record. Already complex, already skilled at agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and social organization. This doesn't mean they appeared out of nowhere, but it does suggest long periods of development that we only partially understand. So the question becomes softer, more nuanced. What if the roots of civilization, not cities or writing yet, but shared behaviours, traditions and ways of organising life began in a world less divided than ours, a world where land travel did not stop at shorelines, where migration followed rivers and plains without interruption, where cultural ideas could spread not by boats, but by footsteps. Imagine early humans, or even pre-human ancestors, living on a planet where movement across vast distances was possible, without ever seeing an ocean. Not easy, certainly, but continuous. Generations could move slowly across thousands of kilometres, never crossing water wider than a river, never facing the psychological barrier of an endless horizon of waves. In such a world, isolation would mean something different. Cultures would still diverge, climates would still vary, but the idea of being cut off entirely would be rarer. Knowledge could diffuse gradually. Technologies, once discovered, might travel farther before being lost. Myths could evolve while still sharing common roots across immense distances. This isn't to say such a civilization existed exactly as imagined, with cities spanning the supercontinent. Rather, it's to ask how Earth's physical layout shapes human possibility. Geography is not just background scenery. It is an active participant in history. Mountains channel movement. Rivers invite settlement. Oceans divide stories. On Pangaea, the rules would have been different. The interior of the supercontinent was likely dry and extreme. Far from the moderating influence of oceans, large regions experienced intense heat, cold, and aridity. Life clustered around coastlines, rivers, and inland seas. If early intelligent beings lived there, they would have learned quickly that movement mattered. That survival depended on knowing when to leave, where to go, and how to read subtle environmental signals. Seasonal migration may have been a way of life long before agriculture. Groups could follow climate bands, animals, and vegetation across enormous stretches of land. Over generations, these routes could become traditions, stories tied not to a single place, but to journeys themselves. Knowledge passed along paths rather than anchored to cities. This way of living leaves a light archaeological footprint. Nomadic cultures, especially ancient ones, rarely leave behind stone monuments or durable cities. Their knowledge lives in tools, oral traditions, and patterns of movement. When continents later drift apart, those patterns would fracture. Stories once connected would diverge. Technologies would adapt to new constraints. Shared origins would fade into myth. It's worth noticing how many ancient cultures separated today by oceans share strikingly similar themes. Flood stories, sky deities, serpents, dragons, world trees, sacred mountains. These similarities are often explained by shared human psychology or independent invention. But geography also matters. When land is continuous, stories can travel with people. Even language itself is shaped by movement. Linguistic families spread across continents in ways that suggest long, slow diffusion rather than sudden leaps. A unified landmass would encourage this, dialects shifting gradually over distance instead of branching sharply at coastlines. As Pangaea began to break apart, starting with rifts that widened into seas, these slow gradients would snap. Populations once connected by land would find themselves separated by water. Over time, boats would bridge some gaps, but not all. Isolation would increase. Cultures would crystallize into distinct identities. Technologies would diverge. The memory of shared origins would blur. From this perspective, the breakup of Pangaea is not just a geological event. It's a narrative turning point. The moment when humanity's potential paths became narrower, more local, more fragmented. Not worse, just different. Consider how differently history unfolds on islands versus continents. Isolation breeds uniqueness, but also vulnerability. Connected land breeds exchange, but also competition. A supercontinent tilts the balance toward continuity, toward long arcs of cultural inheritance rather than sharp breaks. It's also possible that early hominins experienced the last echoes of a more connected world. While Pangaea itself was gone, remnants like Gondwana and Laurasia lingered. Land bridges like Beringia connected continents during ice ages. Lower sea levels revealed pathways now drowned. Even in relatively recent times, the world was more walkable than it is today. From that angle, the idea of a first civilization on Pangaea becomes less about dates and more about mindset. Civilization as a process rather than a place. A slow accumulation of shared habits, mutual learning, and adaptive knowledge developed in a world that encouraged movement rather than confinement. As continents drifted and seas rose, those habits would have been forced to change. Agriculture would emerge as movement became harder. Permanent settlements would become more valuable. Writing would arise to store knowledge no longer easily exchanged in person. Borders, in a sense, would begin as coastlines. So when we ask what if the first civilization lived on Pangaea, we're also asking something quieter. What kind of beings are we when the world is open? How do we behave when there are fewer barriers between us? What do we remember and what do we lose when the ground itself decides to move on? Long before coastlines learned how to curve away from one another, before oceans practiced the art of separation, the land existed in a very different mood. Not dramatic, not restless, not yet fragmented into familiar shapes, but settled into a long, quiet arrangement that lasted far longer than any human era ever could. When all lands were one, the earth was not rushing anywhere. It was simply being itself, slowly, patiently, under skies that did not yet know the outlines of future continents. Pangaea was not a single moment frozen in time. It was a phase, a condition, a long chapter in Earth's deep story where land touched land everywhere it could. Mountains rose where plates collided, vast plains stretched across interior regions, and coastlines wrapped around the outer edge like a single continuous rim. If you could walk across it, you would not cross borders or oceans. You would cross climates, elevations and ecosystems, but always on foot, always on stone that remembered being connected. This matters because stillness changes things. A world that stays arranged for millions of years allows patterns to deepen. Rivers carve more decisively. Winds settle into reliable habits. Life adapts not to constant rearrangement, but to consistency. When land does not drift apart quickly, relationships between place and organism become intimate, almost conversational. The Earth and its living layers learn each other slowly. The interior of Pangaea was vast, larger than anything we experience today. Far from the moderating presence of ocean water, the climate there was extreme in a way that feels unfamiliar now. Summers could be punishingly hot, winters bitterly cold. Rainfall was scarce in many regions, creating enormous deserts that stretched for thousands of kilometres. These were not empty places, but they demanded respect. Life that survived there had to be resilient, patient, and deeply attuned to subtle changes. Closer to the edges of the supercontinent, conditions softened. Coastal regions experienced more regular rainfall. Forests grew thick in some zones. Inland seas and river systems formed lifelines, threading through the land like quiet veins. These areas would have been especially attractive to any intelligent beings capable of planning, remembering, and passing knowledge along. Not because they were easy, but because they were dependable. A quiet place does not mean an empty one. It means fewer sudden disruptions, no rapid continental collisions, no sudden island formations isolating populations overnight. Change still happened, but it happened slowly enough for life to adapt in place rather than flee. Extinctions occurred, of course, but so did long periods of stability where ecosystems matured rather than reset. If we imagine early hominins, or even hypothetical precursors to humanity, living in such a world, their experience of Earth would be very different from ours. Not smaller, but larger in a continuous way. Distance would not be defined by shorelines, but by effort and memory. A journey would not end because land stopped, but because food did, or water did, or the climate shifted beyond tolerance. This kind of world favours long-distance familiarity. Over generations, routes become known, valleys become remembered, mountains become landmarks, not just geographically, but culturally. Stories would likely grow outward rather than inward. Instead of myths anchored to a single sacred place, narratives might follow paths, migrations, seasonal circuits. Meaning would travel. The quietness of such a land is also geological. Without frequent rearrangement, rocks record long histories. Layers accumulate patiently. Fossils settle into deep, orderly archives. From our modern perspective, this makes Pangaea one of the clearest windows into Earth's biological past. It is a place where cause and effect had time to leave legible traces. That same legibility would apply to living cultures. Skills could be refined rather than reinvented repeatedly. Toolmaking traditions might persist with gradual improvements instead of abrupt regional divergence. Knowledge of plants, animals, weather patterns, and terrain could accumulate across enormous distances, spreading not through conquest or trade networks, but through quiet movement and shared ancestry. Silence, in this context, is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of interruption. In our world today, oceans interrupt movement. They create psychological edges as much as physical ones. To cross them requires intention, technology, and risk. On Pangaea, those interruptions were fewer. Not absent, but fewer. Rivers are barriers, yes, but also invitations. Mountains block, but also guide. Deserts discourage, but do not forbid. The land speaks in gradients rather than walls. This would shape how beings understand space. Instead of thinking in terms of here and there divided by water, they might think in terms of near, far, higher, drier, colder. Navigation would be environmental rather than cartographic. Memory would replace maps. Storytelling would replace signage. A quiet world also changes the tempo of cultural change. When groups remain connected, innovations spread more evenly. There is less pressure to differentiate for survival. Cultural drift still occurs, but slowly, like accents changing over distance rather than languages snapping into incomprehensibility. Over thousands of years, this could produce a surprisingly cohesive behavioural landscape, not uniform but intelligible across distances. A traveller arriving from far away might not recognise every custom, but would recognise the logic behind them. The rhythm of daily life would feel familiar even when the details differed. It's important to remember that quiet does not mean peaceful. Predators existed, competition existed, scarcity existed, but conflict would play out within a shared ecological framework rather than across isolated worlds. Migration could relieve pressure. Movement could be a solution rather than a threat. The night sky over Pangaea would look much the same as it does now, but its meaning might differ. Without oceans dividing observers, star patterns could anchor shared calendars across enormous regions. Seasonal cycles tied to celestial movements could synchronize behaviors across the land. The same sky, rising and setting over a continuous world, encourages shared timekeeping. This is one of the subtler effects of a unified landmass. Time itself becomes more communal. When sunrise, seasons, and climate transitions occur gradually across connected space, coordination becomes easier. Agriculture, if it emerges, spreads along environmental lines rather than jumping barriers. Herding routes align. Ceremonies synchronize. Even before agriculture, hunter-gatherer societies rely on timing. Migration of animals, flowering of plants, changes in water availability. In a unified world, these signals ripple across space in predictable ways. Knowledge of them becomes transferable. A lesson learned in one region applies with adjustments to another. The quietness of Pangaea also lies in its slowness to surprise. Earthquakes happened, volcanoes erupted. but tectonic drama was muted compared to periods of rapid continental collision or breakup. This creates a sense of reliability at the planetary scale, a background assumption that the ground beneath you tomorrow will resemble the ground beneath you today. Psychologically, that matters. Stability encourages investment, not just physical, but cognitive. Why build deep traditions if the land is about to vanish or flood? Why memorize routes if coastlines redraw themselves quickly? On Pangaea, memory paid dividends. As millions of years passed, life evolved in dialogue with this stability. Large animals roamed wide territories. Plant species adapted to long-distance dispersal. Ecosystems stretched and blended rather than isolating sharply. The biosphere itself became a network rather than an archipelago. When we imagine the first civilization in this context, it becomes less about cities and more about continuity. Civilization as a shared way of understanding the world, transmitted through movement and memory. Not carved in stone yet, but carried in habits, in expectations, in the quiet assumption that the land goes on. Eventually, though, the quiet began to fray. Deep beneath the surface, heat built up. Mantle currents shifted. The supercontinent, heavy and insulated, trapped warmth. Stress accumulated along invisible seams. Cracks formed, not suddenly, but persistently. Rifts opened. Valleys sank. Water crept in. At first, these changes would be subtle. A widening river here, a saltier inland sea there. Generations might pass before anyone noticed that routes were becoming longer, that familiar paths now ended in marsh or water. This is how great changes often begin, not with catastrophe, but with inconvenience. As Pangaea slowly began to loosen its grip on itself, the quiet world started to introduce pauses. Detours, decisions. Do you turn back, or do you adapt? Do you cross, or do you settle? Over time, these choices would compound. Paths once taken for granted would require new tools, new skills, new stories. The land was still one, but it was learning how not to be. And in that gradual shift, the seeds of later civilizations, as we recognize them, may have been planted. When movement becomes harder, memory becomes more precious. When routes close, places gain importance. When separation begins, identity sharpens. But at this moment, when all lands were one quiet place, the world had not yet asked those questions. It offered openness instead, continuity, a patient surface on which life could experiment with connection before learning the meaning of distance. To imagine humanity before the continents drifted apart, it helps to let go of the mental map we're used to carrying. The one with blue oceans separating everything, the one that makes distance feel final and borders feel natural. Instead, picture a surface that keeps going, where walking is limited not by water but by time, weather, and the strength of your legs. This isn't about placing modern humans in the wrong era. It's about exploring how intelligence, cooperation, and shared behaviour might unfold on a planet that hasn't yet learned how to divide itself. At its core, humanity is not defined by buildings or writing, but by patterns. Patterns of movement, patterns of cooperation, patterns of remembering and teaching. Those patterns emerge long before cities do. They emerge wherever beings rely on each other, plan beyond the moment, and carry knowledge forward rather than letting each generation start from nothing. A connected world changes how those patterns form. In a land without oceans breaking it into separate theatres of history, early human ancestors would not experience the world as a collection of isolated regions. Instead, they would experience it as gradients. The ground might rise slowly, the air might grow drier, animals might change shape and behaviour over distance. But there would be no sudden moment where land simply ends and something fundamentally different begins. That alone reshapes how identity develops. Identity in such a world would be less about place and more about practice. what you know how to do, how you hunt, how you gather, how you move with the seasons, who you cooperate with. In a connected landmass, groups don't need to define themselves as sharply against others because contact remains possible. Even when groups diverge, the divergence is slow, layered, and often reversible. This suggests a humanity that is more fluid in its early stages, less rigidly territorial, more accustomed to encounter. Meeting unfamiliar people would not be rare or alarming. It would be expected, a consequence of movement. Over time, this expectation could shape social instincts, encouraging communication, adaptation, and tolerance for variation rather than fear of it. Language, for example, would evolve differently. In a fragmented world, languages branch and isolate. In a connected one, they slide. Dialects change gradually across distance. Words shift, but meanings overlap. Mutual understanding persists longer. Even when speech differs, gestures, rhythms, and shared activities bridge gaps. This doesn't mean everyone speaks the same way. It means the boundaries between ways of speaking are softer. Someone travelling far from their birthplace might notice accents changing, vocabulary drifting, but still find ways to communicate basic needs, warnings, and cooperation. Over generations, this kind of linguistic continuity creates families of expression that span enormous areas without fully breaking apart. Movement itself would be central to life, not as wandering without purpose, but as deliberate response to the environment. When food shifts, people shift. When climate changes, routes adjust. Knowledge becomes tied to movement. Knowing when to leave is as important as knowing where to go. Children grow up learning not just places but paths. Paths, in this sense, are more than trails. They are memory systems. They encode seasonal timing, water sources, safe crossings, dangerous regions. They carry stories, not as entertainment, but as instruction. A story about a long walk might also be a map, a calendar, and a warning all at once. In a connected world, these paths could stretch for hundreds or thousands of kilometres, passed down not as a single journey, but as a sequence of segments. Each group knows its part well and trusts that others know theirs. Cooperation doesn't require a central authority. It requires continuity. This is where the idea of early civilization becomes less about monuments and more about shared expectation. Civilization as the assumption that knowledge will be preserved, that skills matter beyond one lifetime, that teaching is worth the effort, that cooperation extends beyond immediate kin. Such assumptions don't require cities. They require stability and connection. Pangaea, with its long-lasting geography, provides both. Consider how tool-making might develop in this context. A useful innovation, such as a better cutting edge, or a more efficient fire-starting method, doesn't remain confined to a small region. It travels with people. Over time, it becomes standard practice across wide areas, modified slightly by local materials but recognizable in form and function. This kind of diffusion reduces redundancy. Groups don't need to reinvent tools repeatedly. Instead, they refine them. Incremental improvement replaces repeated rediscovery. Over long periods, this leads to surprisingly sophisticated outcomes, even without centralized planning. The same applies to social practices, child-rearing methods, conflict resolution, resource sharing. These behaviors evolve through trial and error. In a connected world, successful practices spread, less effective ones fade. Over time, this can produce a loose but widespread cultural coherence. It's also worth considering how early humans would perceive scale. In a fragmented world, scale feels constrained. There is only so far you can go before water intervenes. In a connected one, scale is experiential. You don't know how far the land goes until you've walked it, or heard about it from others. This creates a sense of openness that's hard to replicate today. The world feels large, but not closed. There is always somewhere else. Always another valley, another plain, another group living slightly differently. Curiosity becomes adaptive. Fear of the unknown becomes less useful. That doesn't mean danger disappears, it means danger is contextual rather than absolute. A new region might be risky, but it's still land, still familiar in structure, still governed by gravity, weather, and biology. Oceans, by contrast, introduce a fundamentally different environment that requires a conceptual leap. Pangaea delays that leap. Delayed oceanic separation also delays certain technological pressures. Boat building, navigation, and long-distance maritime trade arise because water creates gaps that demand solutions. On a unified landmass, those pressures are weaker. Energy is invested elsewhere. Overland transport improves. Load-carrying techniques evolve. Animal domestication may take different forms. This shifts the timeline of innovation, but not necessarily its sophistication. Human creativity doesn't vanish without boats. It simply flows into other channels. Perhaps architecture emerges later, while environmental knowledge deepens earlier. Perhaps astronomy becomes more important than navigation, because the sky is the most consistent reference across vast land. A shared sky over a connected world invites shared stories. Constellations observed from one region are visible from others, with gradual shifts. Star-based calendars become communal. Seasonal rituals align over wide distances. Time itself becomes something collectively observed rather than locally defined. This could create a sense of belonging that extends beyond immediate surroundings. Not nationalism, but planetary familiarity. The idea that the world is large but intelligible, that others exist elsewhere, living parallel lives under the same stars. As continents begin to drift apart, this mindset would be challenged. Routes would break, familiar paths would end at water, communication would slow, practices once shared would begin to diverge. Over generations, identities would sharpen, languages would branch, technologies would adapt to isolation. But before that happens, humanity, or at least humanity's ancestors, would experience a long period of openness, a phase where connection is the default rather than the exception, where difference exists, but separation does not yet dominate. This raises an interesting possibility. Some of the behaviours we consider uniquely human, such as empathy for strangers, curiosity about others, and the ability to cooperate across groups, may be easier to cultivate in such a world. When strangers are a regular part of life, social intelligence becomes essential. Trust, of course, would still be cautious, but it would be practiced. Negotiation, signalling, and shared ritual would evolve not as luxuries but as survival tools. These are the foundations of later civilization, laid long before permanent settlements. Even conflict would look different. On a connected landmass, retreat is possible. Avoidance is an option. Groups can move rather than fight. This doesn't eliminate violence, but it changes its role. Conflict becomes episodic rather than defining. Alliances matter more than fortifications. The physical human body might also adapt subtly to such conditions. Endurance becomes valuable. Walking long distances shapes physiology. Efficient thermoregulation matters across varied climates. Flexibility in diet becomes advantageous. These traits align closely with what we already know about early human evolution, suggesting that a connected world supports the kind of adaptability humans display. Memory, too, would be trained differently. When survival depends on remembering routes, seasons, and social relationships across distance, memory becomes spatial and narrative. Stories aren't just entertainment, they are storage systems. A well-told story preserves knowledge more reliably than any early artifact. Over time, this could lead to complex oral traditions with remarkable accuracy. We already see hints of this in indigenous cultures, whose oral histories preserve environmental events thousands of years old. A connected world would amplify this effect. When writing eventually emerges, it may do so not as a sudden leap, but as a response to loss. As roots break and communities separate, Memory becomes fragile. Writing becomes a tool to preserve what movement no longer can. In this way, fragmentation drives formalization. So imagining humanity before the continents drifted apart is not about imagining an advanced lost civilization hidden in deep time. It's about imagining a long, slow prelude. A humanity learning how to be human in a world that allows connection to stretch rather than snap. This perspective doesn't contradict what we know from archaeology. It complements it. It fills in the emotional and social landscape that artifacts alone cannot capture. Stone tools tell us what people made. A connected world helps us imagine how they thought. As the land slowly begins to pull itself apart, this early humanity doesn't disappear. It adapts. Some groups become isolated. Others innovate. Some memories are preserved. Others are reshaped into myth. The quiet continuity of the unified world fades, replaced by sharper edges and new challenges. But the habits formed during that earlier openness don't vanish entirely. They echo in shared symbols, in parallel myths, in the human tendency to recognize ourselves in others, even across vast distances. The continents drift, but humanity carries forward something learned when the land was still one, a sense, perhaps faint but persistent, that separation is not the natural state of things. That connection came first, and that even now across oceans, the ground beneath us remembers a time when distance was measured only by how far you were willing to walk. To understand what Pangaea looked like beneath ancient skies, it helps to strip away the familiar colours and borders that modern maps have taught us to expect. No neat blues outlining continents, no recognisable silhouettes. Instead, imagine a single, immense expanse of land occupying much of the planet's surface, wrapped almost entirely by one global ocean. The sky above it would feel vast in a different way, not because the land was small, but because it went on and on, uninterrupted, meeting the horizon in every direction with no promise of water to stop it. Pangaea was not uniform, and it was not gentle everywhere. It was a land of strong contrasts shaped by forces that had been pressing, colliding, and settling for millions of years. At its heart lay enormous interior regions far removed from any coastline. These inland areas experienced extremes that would feel harsh by modern standards. Without nearby oceans to regulate temperature, summers could become intensely hot, baking the ground under a relentless sun. Winters, on the other hand, could plunge into severe cold, with dry air stripping warmth away quickly once daylight faded. Under those skies, clouds behaved differently. Moisture was scarce in many regions, so rainfall was uneven and often seasonal. Long dry periods could stretch on, punctuated by sudden storms that reshaped the land in brief dramatic moments. Rivers did not flow gently year-round in many places. They surged when rain came and retreated when it did not, carving wide channels and leaving behind floodplains that briefly bloomed with life before drying again. Closer to the edges of the supercontinent, conditions softened. Coastal regions benefited from the moderating influence of the surrounding ocean. Temperatures fluctuated less dramatically. Rainfall was more reliable. These areas supported dense vegetation, wetlands, and thriving ecosystems. Forests spread where soil and moisture allowed, while mangrove-like environments formed along shallow coastal shelves. Above all of this, the sky itself followed rhythms that were both familiar and subtly different. The sun rose and set much as it does now, tracing arcs that shifted with the seasons. The moon still governed tides, though its influence reached far inland through atmospheric effects rather than coastal waves. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns recognizable to modern eyes, yet seen from latitudes and arrangements that no longer exist. Without modern light pollution, the night sky over Pangaea would have been overwhelming in its clarity. The Milky Way would stretch brightly across the darkness, casting a faint glow on open plains. Constellations would feel close, almost tactile, their movements marking time with dependable precision. For any intelligent beings beneath that sky, celestial observation would not be a specialized activity. It would be unavoidable. The land itself bore the marks of long compression. Where continental plates had collided to form Pangaea, massive mountain ranges rose. Some of these were ancestors to mountains we know today, now eroded into rolling hills or split apart by oceans. Others have vanished almost entirely, worn down by time. These ranges influenced wind patterns, rainfall distribution, and migration routes. They created rain shadows that deepened deserts on one side while feeding forests on the other. Between mountains stretched vast plains. These were not uniform grasslands, but mosaics of ecosystems responding to subtle changes in elevation, soil composition, and climate. Some supported hardy shrubs and drought-tolerant plants. Others hosted seasonal grasslands that followed the pulse of rain. Life adapted not to stability, but to predictability. Even harsh environments became livable if their patterns could be learned. Volcanic activity dotted parts of the landscape, particularly along rift zones where the supercontinent was beginning, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to pull apart. Lava flows created new land, ash-enriched soils. These areas could be dangerous, but they were also fertile, attracting life once the ground cooled. Over generations, volcanic regions might become hubs of biodiversity, their risks balanced by their rewards. Pangaea's skies also carried a different atmosphere in subtle ways. Oxygen levels fluctuated across geological time, sometimes higher, sometimes lower than today. Carbon dioxide concentrations were often elevated, contributing to warmer global temperatures during certain periods. This greenhouse effect shaped weather patterns, extended growing seasons in some regions, and intensified heat in others. Storm systems moved across the land without interruption by oceans. Winds could travel vast distances, gathering strength over open terrain. Dust storms were likely common in arid interiors, lifting fine particles high into the atmosphere and carrying them across regions. These dust clouds influenced climate, reflecting sunlight, seeding distant soils, and occasionally dimming the sky for days at a time. For life beneath these skies, adaptability was everything. Plants developed strategies to survive long droughts or sudden floods. Animals evolved behaviours suited to migration, endurance, and opportunistic feeding. Large herbivores could roam widely, following vegetation cycles across enormous territories. Predators followed them, shaping ecosystems through pressure and balance. If we imagine early human ancestors living in this world, their perception of place would be inseparable from the sky above it. With few permanent landmarks across open plains, the sun, moon, and stars would serve as guides. Direction, time, and season would be read from the heavens as much as from the ground. Knowledge of the sky would be practical, not abstract. Daytime under Pangaea's skies could be intense. With fewer forests in interior regions, shade would be scarce. The sun's heat would dictate activity patterns. Early beings might travel at dawn and dusk, resting during the harshest midday hours. This rhythm, still present in many hot regions today, would be essential for survival. Night, by contrast, would bring relief and danger in equal measure. Temperatures could drop sharply. Sounds would carry far across open land. The stars would provide orientation, but darkness would also conceal threats. Fire, once mastered, would become central not just for warmth and cooking, but for safety and social gathering. Beneath ancient skies, firelight would mark human presence like small moving constellations on the ground. Seasonal changes would be pronounced in many parts of Pangaea. Without oceans to buffer transitions, shifts from wet to dry or warm to cold could be abrupt. Knowledge of these cycles would be vital. When to move, when to stay, when to store resources, when to prepare for scarcity. This necessity would encourage observation, watching clouds, tracking wind direction, noticing subtle changes in animal behaviour. Over time, these observations would accumulate into shared understanding. Weather lore would not be superstition. It would be experience encoded into memory and story. The scale of the land also affects sound and silence. In open regions, sound travels far. A call, a tool striking stone, even footsteps can carry across surprising distances. This influences communication and caution. It also shapes how communities space themselves. Too close and resources are strained. Too far and cooperation becomes harder. Beneath ancient skies, the horizon itself would be a constant companion. Always visible, always distant. The sense of openness could be both comforting and unsettling. There is nowhere to hide from the weather, no easy refuge from change. The sky is always present, watching, responding, influencing. Cloud formations over Pangaea would stretch across entire regions, not broken by coastlines. A storm seen far away might arrive days later, predictable in its movement. This gives time to prepare, to move, to adjust plans. Again, predictability matters more than gentleness. It's also important to consider colour, not just the blue of the sky, but the tones of the land beneath it. Dust, minerals, vegetation, and light interact differently depending on latitude and atmosphere. Some regions would glow red or ochre under the sun. Others would appear pale, almost white, reflecting heat. Forested zones would deepen into dark greens and browns, shadows pooling beneath dense canopies. Sunrise and sunset across such a continuous landmass would feel expansive. The sun would climb and fall across uninterrupted horizons, its light travelling over thousands of kilometres of connected terrain. Twilight could linger, colours stretching and blending as dust and moisture filtered the light. For beings capable of reflection, these skies would invite interpretation, not abstract philosophy, but practical meaning. The sky tells you when to move, when to rest, when to prepare. It becomes a partner in daily life. As Pangaea aged, its skies subtly changed. Rifts opened, allowing moisture to penetrate farther inland. New seas formed, altering weather patterns. Winds shifted. Rain fell in places long dry. These changes would not be sudden, but over generations they would reshape familiar landscapes. For any populations living through these transitions, memory would stretch across different worlds. Elders might recall drier times. Younger generations might take new lakes for granted. Stories would encode these shifts, blending observation with meaning. Eventually the land beneath those ancient skies would begin to separate in earnest. Water would claim old paths. Horizons would shorten. The sky would remain continuous, but the ground would not. Navigation would change. Movement would slow. Some groups would find themselves on narrowing peninsulas, others on widening plains. But before that fragmentation fully took hold, Pangaea beneath ancient skies offered something rare. A planet where the surface invited connection, where the sky watched over a land that was still whole, where life learned to adapt not to separation, but to continuity. That world no longer exists in that form, but its influence persists, in the way continents still mirror each other across oceans, in the way human beings look up at the same stars from different shores, and in the deep, quiet sense that the Earth once allowed its inhabitants to know it as a single place beneath a single, unbroken sky, long before the land decided to drift and teach us what distance really means. The question of whether early humans could have walked the world end-to-end sounds at first like a poetic exaggeration, a romantic image of endless wandering across a boundless land. But when you slow the idea down and examine it carefully, it becomes less fanciful and more practical than it seems. Not because anyone set out with the intention of crossing the entire planet, but because walking, over enough time and enough generations, is a remarkably powerful way to move through space. Early humans did not experience distance the way we do now. There were no fixed endpoints called continents, no mental barriers labelled ocean. Movement was not framed as travel for its own sake, but as response. Follow the animals, follow the seasons, follow the water. Each decision might cover only a few kilometres, each lifetime perhaps a few hundred. But generations overlap and paths accumulate. In a connected landmass, there is no single moment when someone decides to walk far. There is only the next place that makes sense, the next valley with better shelter, the next plain where herds gather, the next river that still flows when others dry up. Over centuries, these small decisions add up to astonishing reach. We already know that humans are capable of this kind of expansion. Even in a fragmented world, Homo sapiens spread from Africa to every inhabited continent in a relatively short span of evolutionary time. They crossed deserts, mountains, and eventually oceans, often with limited technology. This wasn't driven by conquest or curiosity alone. It was driven by adaptability and persistence. On a unified landmass, that expansion becomes smoother. Not faster necessarily, but less constrained. No coastlines force a halt. No sudden need for boats interrupts movement. Migration becomes continuous rather than punctuated. Routes can bend, curve, and loop without stopping altogether. It's also important to recognise that early humans were not isolated individuals wandering aimlessly. They moved in groups, families, bands, extended kin networks. These groups carried children, elders, tools, and knowledge. Movement was social, not solitary. Decisions were shared. Memory was collective. When one group moved into a new area, it did not necessarily replace those already there. Sometimes it joined them. Sometimes it merged. Sometimes it learned and moved on. This creates layers of presence rather than clean lines of succession. Over time, these layers can stretch across immense distances without erasing continuity. Walking the world end to end does not mean one person doing it in one lifetime. It means that the world is walkable in principle, that there is no absolute edge that stops the process. The end becomes conceptual rather than physical. In a Pangaean world, the largest obstacles would not be oceans but climate zones, deserts, mountain ranges, extreme cold or heat. But even these are not absolute barriers. They are filters. Some groups pass through slowly, others go around, others adapt and remain. Consider deserts. Today, they feel like empty voids. But deserts have always had edges, seasonal resources and pathways. Early humans learned to navigate them using stars, landforms and memory. They timed their movements carefully. They carried water. They followed animal trails. Deserts slow movement, but they do not forbid it. Mountain ranges function similarly. They funnel movement into passes. They create rain shadows. They demand effort. But they also provide resources, shelter, and vantage points. Humans have crossed mountains repeatedly throughout history, often with surprisingly minimal equipment. Cold regions pose their own challenges, yet humans adapted to them as well, developing clothing, shelters, and social strategies to survive long winters. Even before advanced tools, cooperation and shared knowledge made cold survivable. On a unified landmass, these environments would exist in long bands rather than isolated pockets. Movement through them would be gradual. Groups would adjust over generations. Children born in cooler regions would grow up adapted to them. Knowledge would refine slowly, rather than through abrupt exposure. This gradualism is key. Sudden transitions are dangerous. Slow transitions are learnable. Walking the world end to end also implies a kind of cognitive map that extends beyond immediate surroundings. Early humans likely held mental models of the land that were relational rather than absolute. Not north and south in a modern sense, but beyond the big river, past the dry plains, where the ground rises and the air cools. These maps were embedded in stories about ancestors who came from elsewhere, about places visited long ago, about routes taken during times of hardship. Over time, these narratives created a sense of continuity across space. In a connected world, those stories could travel along with people. A tale told in one region might have echoes thousands of kilometres away. not because it was broadcast, but because it walked there, carried by generations of movement and retelling. The physical act of walking also shapes perception. When you move through land at human speed, you notice details that disappear when travel becomes rapid. Changes in soil texture, shifts in vegetation, the behavior of animals, subtle gradients of temperature and humidity. These details matter for survival, but they also build familiarity. The land stops feeling abstract. It becomes legible. This legibility supports long-distance movement because the world feels navigable rather than unknown. Fear diminishes when patterns repeat, even if the specifics differ. A forest in one region may not be identical to a forest elsewhere, but its logic is recognizable. Trees offer shade, animals behave in certain ways, water collects in similar places. This familiarity allows humans to extrapolate, to apply known strategies to new environments, to experiment cautiously rather than retreat immediately. It's also worth considering time depth. When we ask whether early humans could have walked the world end to end, we often compress time unconsciously. We imagine a single wave of movement, but the reality is more like a slow tide. Groups move forward, some stop, some turn back, some split, some die out, some merge. The overall trend can still be expansive even if individual trajectories are complex. Over tens of thousands of years, even modest average movement leads to enormous range. A group that relocates only a few kilometers every generation can cover continents without ever experiencing itself as migrating. From within that process, life feels stable. Camps are set up, children are born, elders die. Only in hindsight does the arc become visible. In a Pangaean context, that arc has room to unfold fully. There is no forced pause where land runs out. The only limits are ecological. An ecology, while demanding, is dynamic. Another factor often overlooked is return. Walking the world end to end does not require one-directional expansion. Groups can and do return along familiar routes. Knowledge flows both ways. Innovations spread backward as well as forward. This bidirectional movement reinforces continuity. It prevents total divergence. Even when groups are separated by distance, intermittent contact renews shared practices. This is harder to maintain once oceans intervene. Water creates asymmetry. Crossing it requires specialized effort. Contact becomes sporadic. Knowledge transmission slows. Divergence accelerates. So in a connected landmass, walking the world is not just possible, it is structurally encouraged. There is also the question of motivation. Why would early humans keep moving rather than settle permanently? The answer is that settlement itself is often a response to constraint. When resources are abundant and accessible, movement remains a viable strategy. It reduces pressure on local ecosystems. It spreads risk. Permanent settlement becomes advantageous when movement is restricted, when fertile land is limited, when predictable resources can be controlled. These conditions arise more readily in fragmented landscapes. In a unified world, especially one with vast interiors, mobility remains useful for much longer. This delays certain social pressures that lead to hierarchy, territorial defence, and intensive agriculture. Instead, social complexity may develop through networks rather than nodes, through shared routes rather than fixed centres. Authority might be situational rather than centralised. Knowledge holders gain respect not because they control land, but because they remember paths. This kind of social organisation leaves little durable trace. It is resilient but light. It adapts rather than accumulates. From an archaeological perspective, it can appear invisible. That invisibility is often mistaken for absence. When we find early human sites scattered across continents, we tend to interpret them as isolated pockets. But in a connected world, they may represent points along a continuum, camps along a route, seasonal stops, meeting places revisited over generations. The gaps between sites may not indicate emptiness, but movement. Walking the world end to end also reframes how we think about boundaries. In a connected landmass, boundaries are ecological rather than political. They shift with climate. They are negotiated rather than enforced. Crossing them requires adaptation, not permission. This flexibility fosters a different relationship with space. Ownership is less rigid. Territory is understood through use rather than control. Land belongs to those who know how to live with it. As Pangaea began to fragment, these patterns would come under strain. Routes would end abruptly, familiar paths would flood, movement would require new solutions. Some groups would adapt by developing boats, others would settle, others would turn inward. But before that fragmentation, walking remained a viable answer to most challenges. Scarcity could be met with movement. Conflict could be avoided by distance. Curiosity could be satisfied without crossing an existential boundary. So could early humans have walked the world end to end, not as a single journey, not as an achievement to be recorded, but as a slow, cumulative process woven into daily life. The world was not walked all at once. It was worn in, step by step, story by story, generation by generation. And as the land itself began to pull apart, creating seas where paths once ran, humanity carried with it the memory of a time when movement was continuous, when the horizon always led somewhere reachable, when the idea of an end was not yet part of the map. That memory may linger still, quietly shaping how we think about distance, connection, and the deep human instinct to keep going, even when we don't quite know where the path will lead next. Life on a supercontinent is governed less by comfort and more by pattern. Climate, seasons, and survival become inseparable ideas, woven together by necessity rather than theory. On Pangaea, the environment did not merely surround its inhabitants, it instructed them. Every shift in temperature, every change in wind direction, every delay in rain carried information. To live there, especially as an early human or human ancestor, was to become fluent in those signals. The first thing to understand about climate on a supercontinent is scale. When land stretches uninterrupted for thousands of kilometres, weather systems behave differently. Oceans are powerful regulators of climate. They absorb heat, release it slowly, and soften extremes. Pangaea, with its immense interior far from any coastline, lacked that moderation across much of its surface. As a result, climate zones were sharper, drier, and more demanding in many regions. The interior of the supercontinent was dominated by aridity. Vast stretches received little rainfall for long periods. This was not a uniform desert, but a patchwork of dry plains, seasonal scrublands, and regions that oscillated between harsh dryness and brief abundance. Rain, when it came, could be intense and short-lived, turning dry channels into rivers almost overnight. Survival depended not on the amount of rain, but on knowing when it would arrive and how long it would last. Seasonality on Pangaea was often exaggerated. Without nearby oceans to smooth transitions, shifts between wet and dry seasons, or warm and cold periods could be abrupt. The difference between a survivable landscape and a hostile one might come down to timing measured in weeks rather than months. This made seasonal awareness one of the most critical skills any population could possess. For early humans, seasons were not abstract divisions of a calendar. They were lived experiences that shaped every decision. When to move, when to stay, when to hunt, when to conserve energy, when to expect scarcity. A mistake in timing could be fatal. A correct judgment could sustain an entire group. Unlike modern societies, which can buffer against seasonal change with stored food and built shelter, early humans relied on mobility as their primary adaptation. On a supercontinent, this mobility was both possible and necessary. Climate did not simply change over time, it changed over space. If one region became too dry or too cold, another reachable by land might be more forgiving. This spatial response to climate is one of the defining features of survival on Pangaea. Instead of enduring worsening conditions in place, groups could shift their position gradually. This required intimate knowledge of climate gradients, not just where resources were, but how they moved through the year. Animals on Pangaea followed these gradients. Large herbivores migrated in response to vegetation cycles. Predators followed them. Early humans, as both hunters and opportunistic foragers, would have learned to read these movements. A changing climate was often first noticed through animal behaviour. A herd that failed to arrive. A bird species that lingered longer than usual. These were warnings encoded in motion. Plant life also reflected the climate's rhythm. Certain plants would only fruit after specific rainfall patterns. Others thrived briefly after floods. Knowledge of these cycles was cumulative and local, but in a connected world it could spread. Groups encountering similar environments could share strategies, refining survival techniques over generations. Temperature extremes posed their own challenges. In interior regions, daytime heat could be intense, while nights cooled rapidly. This wide thermal range demanded behavioural adaptation. Activity would cluster in cooler hours. Shelter design, even if temporary, would aim to moderate temperature swings. Fire would be used strategically, not just for warmth, but for regulating comfort and safety. Cold seasons, where they occurred, required different strategies. Clothing, constructed from animal hides or plant fibres, became essential. Social cooperation intensified during harsher periods, as shared shelter and pooled resources improved survival odds. Climate pressure tends to encourage social cohesion, and on Pangaea, those pressures were frequent. Wind patterns across the supercontinent were also significant. With few oceanic interruptions, winds could travel long distances, shaping regional climates. Monsoon-like systems developed in some areas, driven by seasonal heating of the landmass. These systems brought predictable rains to certain regions and long dry spells to others. Predictability, even when harsh, is preferable to randomness. It allows planning. Early humans would not have understood monsoons in scientific terms, but they would have understood their effects. They would know when the air smelled different, when clouds gathered in a certain way, when distant thunder meant relief rather than danger. This embodied climate knowledge would be passed down through teaching and story. Survival on a supercontinent also meant dealing with scarcity as a recurring condition rather than an exception. Even in resource-rich regions, abundance was rarely permanent. Dry years came, cold snaps lingered, animal populations fluctuated. Groups that survived were those that treated abundance as temporary and scarcity as expected. This expectation shapes culture. It encourages restraint rather than excess, sharing rather than hoarding, planning rather than consumption. These traits are not moral abstractions, they are practical responses to environmental reality. Food strategies on Pangaea would reflect this. Diets would be diverse, flexible, and opportunistic. Reliance on a single resource would be dangerous. Instead, early humans would exploit a wide range of foods, adjusting seasonally. Meat when available, plants when abundant, insects, roots, seeds, and opportunistic scavenging when necessary. Climate also influenced how long groups stayed in one place. Extended residence required stable resources. In regions where climate variability was high, long-term settlement was risky. Movement reduced that risk. This does not mean constant wandering, but cyclical patterns of return. Seasonal rounds, familiar places revisited at predictable times. These cycles create a different relationship with land. Not ownership, but familiarity. Places are known for what they offer at certain times, not controlled permanently. This flexible attachment is well suited to a supercontinent environment where conditions vary widely across space and time. Water availability was perhaps the most critical factor of all. Rivers, lakes, and seasonal waterholes dictated movement more than any other resource. On Pangaea, Large river systems drained vast areas, but many regions relied on ephemeral sources. Knowing where water would persist longest during dry periods was essential knowledge. This knowledge was often encoded socially. Certain individuals would be recognized as particularly skilled at reading the land. Others would specialize in tracking animals or plants. Division of labor, even in small groups, improved survival under climate stress. Climate also shapes risk. On a supercontinent, extreme weather events could be large in scale. Droughts might affect entire regions. Floods could reshape landscapes. Dust storms could obscure the sky for days. These events tested adaptability and memory. Groups that remembered past disasters could prepare for future ones. Over generations, this leads to cultural memory. Stories about hard years, about places that failed, about routes that saved lives. These stories are not nostalgia, they are survival tools. One important aspect of Pangaea's climate is that while it was harsh in many areas, it was also stable over long periods. The supercontinent configuration persisted for tens of millions of years. This allowed long-term adaptation. Ecosystems evolved in response to consistent patterns rather than constant upheaval. For early humans, this meant that once survival strategies were established, they remained useful for many generations. Refinement replaced reinvention. Cultural knowledge accumulated rather than being repeatedly lost. As Pangaea began to fragment, climate patterns changed. New coastlines formed. Moisture penetrated farther inland. Seasonal rhythms shifted. Regions that were once marginal became habitable. Others dried further. These changes unfolded slowly, but they introduced uncertainty into previously reliable systems. Populations living through this transition would notice subtle shifts first. Rains arriving earlier or later. Rivers changing course. Familiar plants struggling. These changes would prompt movement, experimentation, and eventually innovation. In this sense, climate does not just challenge survival, it drives transformation. The pressures imposed by a supercontinent environment may have favoured traits that later defined humanity. Flexibility, cooperation, long-term memory, social learning. The ability to plan across seasons and generations. Survival on Pangaea was not about conquering the environment, it was about reading it accurately and responding appropriately. Groups that tried to dominate their surroundings without understanding them would fail. Those that observed, adjusted, and shared knowledge endured. This relationship between climate and survival also influences how time is perceived. On a supercontinent, time is measured less by clocks and more by cycles. The return of rains, the migration of animals, the lengthening of shadows. These markers are reliable and meaningful. Living in tune with such cycles encourages patience. You cannot rush a season. You cannot force rain. You wait, prepare, and act when conditions align. This rhythm shapes cognition and behaviour in subtle ways, encouraging long-term thinking over immediate gratification. As we move forward in this exploration, the role of climate remains central. When continents begin to separate, climate gradients change. Seasons become more localized. Isolation increases. Survival strategies adapt again, this time under different constraints. But before those changes take hold, survival on a supercontinent is defined by responsiveness rather than resistance. Climate and seasons are not enemies to be defeated. They are signals to be interpreted, teachers that reward attention and punish neglect. In that world, survival is not guaranteed, but it is learnable. The land offers no mercy, but it offers information. And for early humans living on a single, vast surface beneath an open sky, learning to read that information would be the difference between persistence and disappearance, between movement and stagnation, between a fleeting presence and a lasting human story that continues, shaped by climate, carried through seasons and always adjusting to what the Earth decides to do next. When thinking about animals, plants and neighbours of a lost age, it's useful to pause on the word neighbour. not in the modern sense of fences and property lines, but in the older, quieter sense of sharing space, time, and resources with other living things. On a supercontinent like Pangaea, life did not exist in isolated pockets. It unfolded across a continuous surface, where plants, animals, and early humans influenced one another through proximity rather than separation. To survive, there was to be embedded in a living network that extended far beyond any single group. The plant life of Pangaea formed the foundation of everything else. Long before humans or even mammals took centre stage, plants had already learned how to handle the supercontinent's extremes. In the interior regions, where rainfall was limited and seasonal, vegetation favoured resilience over abundance. Hardy shrubs, drought-tolerant plants, and deep-rooted species dominated. These plants did not grow quickly, but they endured. Their cycles were tuned to rare rains and brief windows of opportunity. Closer to rivers, lakes, and coastal margins, plant life became richer and more diverse. Floodplains supported grasses and flowering plants that responded rapidly to moisture. Forests emerged where rainfall was more reliable, with towering trees forming dense canopies and shaded understories. These forests were not uniform. They varied with latitude, elevation, and soil chemistry, creating a mosaic rather than a single green belt. Plants were not passive background features. They shaped animal movement and behaviour. Grazers followed seasonal growth. Browsers targeted specific shrubs or trees. Seed dispersal depended on animals moving across large distances, carrying plant genetics far from their origin. On a unified landmass, this dispersal could be immense, allowing plant species to spread gradually across entire regions. For early humans, plants were neighbours in the most literal sense. They provided food, medicine, materials, and signals. Knowledge of plants was not optional. It was survival. Which roots could be eaten safely? Which leaves soothed wounds? Which trees burned slowly or produced smoke that repelled insects? This knowledge accumulated over generations and was shared through teaching and imitation. Because the land was connected, similar plant species appeared across wide areas, with variations rather than sharp breaks. This continuity allowed knowledge to travel. A plant recognized in one region might have a close cousin elsewhere, behaving similarly enough to be useful. Trial and error still mattered, but familiarity reduced risk. Animal life on Pangaea was equally shaped by scale. Large herbivores roamed vast territories, their migrations driven by vegetation cycles rather than borders. These animals were not confined by oceans or narrow corridors. Their ranges overlapped and shifted over time, responding to climate and resource availability. Predators followed these movements, creating dynamic ecosystems that balanced growth and consumption. Apex predators exerted pressure that shaped prey behaviour. Smaller predators adapted to niches created by larger ones. Scavengers cleaned up remains, recycling nutrients back into the system. For early humans, animals were both resources and competitors. Large herbivores provided meat, hides, bones, and sinew. Smaller animals offered more reliable, if less dramatic, sources of protein. Insects, birds, and fish supplemented diets where available. Hunting strategies evolved in response to animal behaviour rather than fixed locations. In a connected world, hunting knowledge spread along with people. Successful techniques were observed, copied, and refined. Group hunting, persistence tracking, ambush strategies, and the use of landscape features all developed through close observation of animal movement. Humans did not dominate animals outright. They negotiated with them through understanding. This negotiation extended beyond hunting. Predators that threatened humans were also neighbours to be avoided or respected. Knowledge of where dangerous animals lived, when they were active, and how to deter them was critical. Fire played a major role here, altering animal behaviour and creating safe spaces without eliminating wildlife entirely. The animals of this lost age were not static. Species evolved, migrated, and sometimes vanished. Extinction was part of the system long before humans played a significant role in it. Climate shifts, volcanic events, and ecological competition all contributed. Early humans lived among these changes, adapting alongside them. Plants and animals were not the only neighbours, of course. Other human groups shared the land. On a supercontinent, encounters between groups were inevitable. Some groups were closely related, others less so. Some shared languages or customs, others differed significantly. But separation was rarely absolute. These encounters could be cooperative, cautious, or hostile, depending on circumstances. Resource abundance encouraged sharing or trade. Scarcity increased tension. But because movement was possible, conflict did not always lead to domination or annihilation. Groups could avoid one another, shift routes, or merge temporarily. Cultural exchange in such a setting would be gradual and uneven. Tools, techniques, and stories moved with people. A group encountering a new neighbour might adopt certain practices while retaining others. Over time, this blending created cultural gradients rather than sharp boundaries. This blending is important when considering the idea of a lost age. It suggests that early human culture was not composed of isolated traditions that later converged, but of interconnected practices that slowly diverged as geography changed. On Pangaea, convergence came first. Plants and animals played roles in this cultural exchange as well. A useful plant learned in one region might be carried as seed or memory to another. A hunting strategy developed for one species might be adapted for another elsewhere. The environment itself acted as a medium of communication. Domestication, when it eventually emerged, would be influenced by this continuity. Animals suitable for domestication often have wide ranges and adaptable behaviours. In a connected world, humans could encounter and experiment with such species across different environments, refining their relationships over time. Even before domestication, long-term familiarity with certain animals could lead to mutual tolerance. Scavenging species might follow human camps. Humans might rely on animal behaviour as indicators of danger or opportunity. These relationships are subtle, but they shape survival. The same applies to plants. Certain plants might thrive near human activity, benefiting from disturbed soil or discarded seeds. Humans would notice these patterns, even if unconsciously, and begin to favour them. Over time, these interactions could set the stage for later agriculture. In a supercontinent context, these processes unfold slowly but broadly. Agriculture does not need to emerge everywhere at once. It can appear in one region and spread gradually along connected routes. Knowledge of planting, harvesting and storage moves with people rather than being reinvented independently. The neighbours of this lost age also include microorganisms, though they were unseen. Pathogens, parasites and symbiotic microbes shaped health and survival. In a connected world, diseases could spread gradually, allowing populations to adapt. Immunity patterns would diffuse along with movement, reducing the likelihood of catastrophic isolation-driven epidemics. This gradual exposure matters. Sudden contact between isolated populations often leads to devastating disease outbreaks. A connected landmass mitigates this by preventing long-term biological isolation. Populations share microbial environments over time, building resilience. Fire, again, plays a role here. Controlled burning alters plant communities, reduces parasite loads, and influences animal behaviour. Fire management may have been one of the earliest forms of environmental modification practiced widely by humans. On Pangaea, fire use could spread across vast regions, shaping ecosystems in similar ways. The result is a landscape that is partly natural and partly influenced by human presence, even long before cities or farms. This influence is light, dispersed, and reversible. It does not dominate the land, but it leaves traces. From the perspective of deep time, these traces are subtle. They may not leave clear archaeological markers, but they exist in altered vegetation patterns animal distributions and long-standing fire regimes. The land remembers interaction even when artifacts do not survive. As the continents begin to drift apart, these networks of interaction start to fragment. Plant species become isolated. Animal migrations are interrupted. Human groups lose contact. Over time, neighbours become strangers. Shared practices diverge. Familiar species vanish from certain regions. But before that fragmentation, life on Pangaea is characterised by proximity. Plants, animals, and humans exist in ongoing relationship. Survival depends on attention, respect, and adaptability rather than dominance. This relational way of living shapes cognition. Early humans learned to see themselves as part of a larger system, not in an abstract philosophical sense, but in a practical one. Actions have consequences. Overuse depletes resources. Careless fire spreads uncontrollably. Successful strategies are those that maintain balance over time. Neighbours are not always friendly, but they are known enough to predict, avoid, or cooperate with. This knowledge is shared socially, passed down as instruction and story. In imagining this lost age, it's tempting to romanticize it, to imagine harmony everywhere. That would be inaccurate. Life was hard, mortality was high, mistakes were costly, but it would also be inaccurate to imagine constant struggle without structure. There was order, learned through experience. Animals knew the land, plants responded to cycles, humans observed both and adjusted. This triad formed the core of survival. As we continue forward, the story becomes one of change. As land breaks apart, neighbours are separated. Animals adapt or perish. Plants specialise. Humans innovate under new constraints. The old networks dissolve, replaced by new ones shaped by distance and isolation. Yet echoes of that earlier interconnected world remain, in shared plant lineages, in animal distributions that hint at former continuity, in human cultures that, despite oceans between them, recognise similar patterns of living with the land. Animals, plants, and neighbours of that lost age were not separate chapters of life. They were a single, ongoing conversation carried out across a world that had not yet learned how to divide itself. A conversation that continues, reshaped but unbroken, every time living beings share space, respond to seasons, and adapt together beneath a sky that once watched over a single, continuous land. Fire, tools, and the first shared knowledge did not appear as sudden breakthroughs. They emerged slowly, unevenly, shaped by necessity and refined through repetition. On a supercontinent like Pangaea, where movement was continuous and contact between groups remained possible over long distances, these developments did not belong to one place or one people. They belonged to processes. Knowledge did not stay still. It travelled, adapted, and accumulated, carried by hands, voices, and memory, rather than by records. Fire was not just a technology, it was a relationship. Long before humans learned how to make it reliably, they learned how to live around it. Natural fires caused by lightning were common in many regions of Pangaea, especially in dry interior zones. These fires reshaped landscapes, clearing old growth, encouraging new plants, and altering animal behaviour. Early humans would have observed this long before they controlled it. Burned areas attracted grazing animals. Cooked plants became easier to eat. Predators avoided smouldering ground. Fire changed the rules of the land. At first, fire was something encountered, not created. A lightning strike ignites grassland. A fallen tree burns slowly. An ember survives long enough to be carried. Keeping fire alive may have preceded making fire. Protecting it from wind, feeding it carefully, moving camps around it. These acts required attention and cooperation. Fire punished carelessness and rewarded patience. Once fire could be preserved, it became a centre. Not symbolically at first, but practically. It extended daylight. It made nights safer. It softened food. It hardened tools. It allowed humans to inhabit colder regions and survive harsher seasons. Fire expanded the usable world. On a supercontinent, this expansion mattered more than it might in a fragmented landscape. Fire turned marginal environments into livable ones. Cold nights in open plains, damp forest edges, high elevations. Fire did not erase environmental challenges, but it reduced their severity enough to make movement viable. The knowledge surrounding fire was fragile at first. It could be lost. A group that failed to maintain it might spend generations without it. But in a connected world, loss was less permanent. Groups without fire could encounter those who had it. Observation led to imitation. Techniques spread slowly but persistently. This is where shared knowledge begins to take shape, not as formal teaching but as social learning. Someone notices that another group prepares food differently, that their meat tastes different, that they sleep closer together, that predators keep their distance. Curiosity follows, questions are asked, or gestures exchanged, practices are copied. Fire knowledge also created differentiation within groups. Certain individuals became more skilled at maintaining it. They noticed which materials burned best, how to shelter flames from wind, how to revive embers. These skills conferred status, not through authority, but through usefulness. Survival favoured attentiveness. Tools followed a similar path. Early stone tools were simple by modern standards, but they represented a significant cognitive shift. Selecting a stone, shaping it intentionally, using it for a specific purpose. These actions require foresight. They also require the ability to recognize quality and potential. On Pangaea, suitable materials for tool-making were widespread but varied. Different regions offered different stones, bones, woods, and plant fibres. Toolmakers adapted techniques to local materials. But because the land was connected, techniques themselves could spread even when materials changed. A sharp edge made from one stone could inspire a similar edge made from another elsewhere. The principle mattered more than the substance. Over time, this led to convergence in tool forms across wide areas, with local variations rather than entirely separate traditions. Tool knowledge is cumulative. A better grip improves control. A refined edge lasts longer. A shaped handle reduces injury. Each improvement builds on previous ones. In isolation, this process can stall. In connection, it accelerates. Even small insights once shared save others from repeating mistakes. Fire and tools also interact. Fire hardens wooden tools. It makes stone flaking more predictable. It allows glues and resins to be processed. The combination of fire and tools multiplies possibilities. Together, they mark a threshold where humans begin to alter their environment deliberately rather than reactively. The first shared knowledge emerges from this interplay. Not abstract ideas, but practical sequences. Do this, then that. Use this material, not that one. Wait until this season. Avoid that place at this time. Knowledge is procedural, it lives in actions. Sharing this knowledge requires communication, but not necessarily complex language at first. Demonstration is powerful. So is imitation. Children learn by watching. Outsiders learn by observing from a distance before participating. Over time, gestures and sounds become standardized, supporting more efficient transmission. In a connected landmass, these processes operate over long distances. A technique developed in one region might appear elsewhere generations later, carried by slow migration and repeated teaching. The origin becomes irrelevant. What matters is that it works. This is why early human culture likely shows remarkable similarities across regions despite environmental differences. Fire use, stone tools, cooperative hunting. These are not independent inventions appearing repeatedly by chance. They're shared solutions spreading through connected populations. Fire also changes social structure. It creates a focal point. People gather around it. Food is prepared communally, stories are told, repairs are made, knowledge is exchanged. The fire becomes a social technology as much as a physical one. Nighttime around a fire encourages communication. The day is busy, the night invites reflection. Even simple narratives about the day's events serve to reinforce shared understanding. Over time, these narratives grow more complex. They incorporate memory, instruction, and identity. On a supercontinent, nights are often cold or exposed, especially away from forests. Fire extends habitable hours and spaces. It allows camps to form in places that would otherwise be temporary. These camps become meeting points where knowledge concentrates. Tools also encourage specialization. Not everyone makes the best tools. Some individuals develop skill through practice and observation. Others rely on them. This creates interdependence. Social bonds strengthen. Knowledge becomes valued. Importantly, this knowledge is not hoarded. In early societies, withholding essential survival information harms the group. Sharing benefits everyone. Reputation builds around generosity of knowledge rather than secrecy. As tools improve, so does efficiency. Less energy spent on basic survival frees time for refinement. Better hunting tools increase success. Improved processing reduces waste. Fire cooking improves nutrition. Health improves incrementally. These changes affect cognition. Improved nutrition supports brain development. Longer lifespans allow more knowledge to accumulate. Elders become repositories of experience. Respect for age grows not from tradition, but from utility. On Pangaea, where contact between groups remains possible, elders also serve as bridges. They remember encounters, routes, agreements, past mistakes. This memory reduces conflict and repetition of errors. Fire and tools also alter human impact on the environment. Controlled burning shapes landscapes. Tool-assisted hunting influences animal populations. Humans become ecological actors. This role is not dominant at first, but it is noticeable. In a connected world, these impacts diffuse. No single region bears the full burden. Pressure spreads out. Ecosystems adjust gradually. This reduces the likelihood of catastrophic overexploitation in one place. Shared knowledge evolves not just through success, but through failure. Failed tools are abandoned. Dangerous practices are remembered and avoided. Stories of loss become warnings. These stories travel along with people. As continents later fragment, this shared knowledge begins to regionalize. Practices adapt to local conditions without reinforcement from distant groups. Divergence increases. Innovations arise independently again. But before that fragmentation, there exists a long phase where knowledge moves more freely than people realize. Not rapidly, not intentionally, but persistently. Over generations, fire use becomes ubiquitous. Tool traditions stabilize. Shared understanding deepens. This does not produce a single culture. It produces a family of cultures that recognize each other's logic. Differences exist, but they are variations on common themes. The first shared knowledge is not written. It is enacted. It lives in hands that know how to strike stone, in eyes that judge flame, in voices that caution patience, in movements repeated until they become instinct. Fire teaches timing. Too much and it destroys, too little and it fails. Tools teach precision. A wrong angle breaks stone, a dull edge wastes effort. These lessons shape thinking. Cause and effect become tangible. In this way, technology and cognition co-evolve. Humans do not just use tools. Tools teach humans how to think systematically, how to plan, how to anticipate outcomes, how to learn from mistakes. On a supercontinent, this learning environment is vast. Ideas circulate. Techniques cross paths. Knowledge does not stagnate easily. As the land begins to separate, this circulation slows. Knowledge pools locally. Traditions solidify. New pressures demand new solutions. Writing, storage, and formal teaching become more important. But beneath those later developments lies a foundation built in a world that allowed sharing to come first. Fire, tools, and the first shared knowledge are not milestones reached by isolated geniuses. They are the outcome of connection, repetition, and patience, practiced across a land that had not yet decided to pull itself apart. That foundation remains with us. Every time knowledge spreads through observation, every time a technique is refined rather than reinvented, every time cooperation outperforms isolation. These patterns echo from a time when the land itself made sharing easier, when survival depended not just on strength or speed, but on the quiet power of learning together and carrying that learning forward into whatever landscape waited beyond the next horizon. When a single land stretches without interruption, language and culture grow in ways that are difficult to recreate once distance hardens into separation. They do not emerge as sealed systems. They form as living processes, shaped by movement, contact, and gradual change rather than by isolation. On a supercontinent like Pangaea, where land connects rather than divides, communication is not confined to pockets. It diffuses. Culture does not fracture quickly. It bends, adapts, and blends. Language, at its earliest stages, is inseparable from action. It grows out of shared tasks, repeated gestures, and common needs. Before words become abstract symbols, they are tied to doing, warning calls, signals for coordination, sounds associated with food, danger, direction, or timing. In a connected world, these early vocalizations and gestures encounter variation without immediate rupture. A sound used in one region may shift slightly in another, but contact allows mutual understanding to persist. This is one of the most important consequences of a single land. Languages do not branch sharply at edges. They slide along gradients. Differences accumulate slowly over distance rather than abruptly across barriers. Someone travelling far might hear unfamiliar pronunciations or new terms, but enough overlap remains for communication to function, especially when reinforced by gesture and context. Over generations, this produces linguistic families that are broad, flexible, and internally diverse without being mutually unintelligible. Instead of hundreds of isolated languages forming rapidly, fewer core systems persist longer, evolving through drift rather than division. Change still happens, accents develop, vocabulary adapts to local environments, but complete separation takes much longer. This extended continuity has cultural consequences. Shared stories persist across space, not identical stories, but recognizable ones. A myth told in one region may sound different elsewhere, with local details added, but its structure remains familiar. Characters shift, settings change, the lesson or pattern endures. These stories are not entertainment in the modern sense. They encode knowledge, migration routes, seasonal cycles, social norms, moral boundaries. In a connected landmass, such stories can travel astonishing distances over long periods, carried by people who move gradually rather than by messengers or texts. Culture, in this setting, behaves less like a collection of isolated traditions and more like a spectrum. Practices blend where groups meet frequently. They diverge where contact is rare, but the overall field remains continuous. There are no hard edges yet. Rituals evolve similarly. Certain behaviours become standardised because they work. Ways of greeting, methods of resolving disputes, patterns of sharing food. These practices are reinforced whenever groups interact. Successful ones spread, less effective ones fade. In a fragmented world, ritual can become a marker of identity, used to distinguish insiders from outsiders. In a connected world, ritual is more often a tool for cooperation. It reduces uncertainty during encounters. It signals intent. It establishes trust quickly. This does not eliminate conflict. It makes conflict navigable. Shared expectations allow disputes to be managed without escalating to violence every time. Knowing how others think matters more than asserting dominance. Art, too, reflects continuity. Early symbolic expression likely began with simple marks, objects, or performances tied to shared meaning. body decoration, carved patterns, arranged stones. These expressions communicate belonging and memory. On a single landmass, artistic motifs could echo across regions without becoming identical. A pattern seen in one area might reappear elsewhere in altered form. The resemblance is not coincidence, it is inheritance. Music and rhythm may be especially influenced by connection. Rhythmic patterns tied to walking, working, or communal activity spread easily when people move. A chant used to coordinate effort in one place might appear elsewhere adapted to different tasks. Instruments evolve based on available materials, but rhythm persists. Dance, movement, and posture also carry cultural information. How people move together reveals shared understanding. These embodied practices are resilient. They survive even when words change. The absence of oceans as barriers delays the formation of sharply distinct cultural identities. Identity still exists, but it is relational rather than territorial. People define themselves by lineage, practice, or role more than by exclusive ownership of land. Belonging is not fixed to a point on a map. It is carried with people. This mobility shapes values. Hospitality becomes important because encounters are frequent. Curiosity is rewarded because learning from others improves survival. Suspicion exists, but it is moderated by familiarity. Strangers are not entirely unknown. They are variations of known patterns. This reduces fear and increases the likelihood of exchange. Language adapts to this reality. It becomes rich in descriptors of environment, movement, and relationship. Words for direction, distance, season, and condition proliferate. Language becomes a tool for navigating gradients rather than boundaries. Time, too, is described relationally, not by fixed dates, but by cycles. Before the rains, after the cold, when the herds return. These expressions make sense across large areas because the underlying patterns are shared. As knowledge accumulates, language grows more complex. Grammar emerges to clarify relationships between actions, actors, and outcomes. This complexity does not require writing. It requires repeated communication across contexts. A connected landmass encourages this repetition. Encounters reinforce patterns. Errors are corrected. Innovations spread. Language becomes robust through use. Culture, in this sense, is not static. It is maintained through contact. If contact diminishes, culture stiffens. Variation becomes isolation. On Pangaea, contact remains possible for a very long time. Even spiritual ideas are shaped by this openness. Concepts of the world, the sky, life and death draw from shared experiences. The same stars seen across regions encourage similar cosmologies. Seasonal cycles encourage similar interpretations of time and renewal. Differences still emerge. A desert culture emphasizes endurance and scarcity. A forest culture emphasizes abundance and concealment. But these differences are variations on shared themes rather than entirely separate worldviews. When groups meet, these worldviews are negotiated. People borrow what works, they discard what doesn't. Over time, culture becomes adaptive rather than rigid. This adaptability is crucial. It allows humanity to respond to environmental change without cultural collapse. When climates shift, practices adjust. Language evolves to describe new realities. As the supercontinent begins to fracture, these processes change. Contact becomes harder. Routes close. Shared practices lose reinforcement. Language divergence accelerates. Cultural identities harden. What was once a spectrum becomes a mosaic. But before that happens, language and culture on a single land develop in a way that prioritizes continuity. Memory travels. Stories persist. Understanding stretches farther than geography would later allow. This long phase may explain why human cultures today, despite vast separation, share deep structural similarities. Narrative forms, symbolic patterns, social instincts. These are not random. They are remnants of a time when difference grew slowly rather than being forced apart. Even now, when languages differ dramatically, translation remains possible, not just through words, but through shared human logic. This suggests a common foundation laid early, under conditions that favoured connection. A single land shapes culture by making separation optional rather than inevitable. It allows humanity to practice being plural without being divided. Diversity emerges, but it is layered atop familiarity. This does not produce utopia. It produces resilience. It allows ideas to survive loss. It allows learning to outpace forgetting. As continents drift and oceans widen, humanity carries forward habits formed under earlier conditions. The instinct to communicate, to share stories, to recognize patterns in others even when details differ. Language becomes more than sound. Culture becomes more than tradition. They become tools for bridging distance that geography increasingly enforces. In this way, the legacy of a single land persists long after the land itself is separated. It lives in our ability to learn languages that are not our own, to recognize stories from unfamiliar cultures, to feel that others, far away, are still understandable. Those capacities were shaped in a world where understanding had room to stretch, where land allowed contact to continue long enough for humanity to practice being many things at once without losing coherence. Trade without oceans and journeys without borders would not look like markets or caravans in the way we imagine them today. There would be no ports, no ships arriving from over the horizon, no sense of crossing into a fundamentally different world by stepping onto water. Instead, exchange would grow quietly out of movement itself. On a single, continuous land, travel and trade are not separate activities. They are the same process viewed from different distances. In such a world, the idea of a border barely exists. There are no coastlines to signal a hard stop, no abrupt transitions that demand permission, technology, or courage of a special kind. There are only changes in terrain, climate, and custom, all of which arrive gradually. One valley gives way to another. Soil darkens or lightens. Trees thin or thicken. Accents shift. Tools look slightly different. But nothing announces, clearly and finally, that you have left one world and entered another. This has profound consequences for how exchange develops. Trade, at its most basic level, is not about profit. It is about access. Access to materials you do not have. Access to skills you have not mastered. Access to information you have not yet learned. In a connected landmass, access is achieved first through walking, not through negotiation. You encounter difference before you formalize exchange. Early trade on a supercontinent would be embedded in everyday movement. A group relocates seasonally and encounters another group. They notice unfamiliar materials, a different kind of stone, a tool shaped in an unfamiliar way, a decorative object made from something not found locally. Curiosity follows. Conversation, in whatever form is available, begins. Sometimes exchange is deliberate. An object is offered. Something is requested in return. Other times it is indirect. Knowledge is observed and copied. Materials are gifted rather than traded. Over time, these interactions accumulate into patterns of exchange without ever becoming institutions. Journeys without borders encourage this kind of diffusion. When people move freely, ideas and objects travel incidentally. A person might carry a stone tool made far from where they now live, not because it is rare or valuable in a market sense, but because it works well. Someone else notices and asks how it was made. The knowledge spreads. The original stone might never be traded again, but its influence persists. This is trade without transaction in the modern sense. It is exchange without accounting. Materials themselves shape the roots of this exchange. Certain stones suitable for tool-making are only found in specific geological formations. Obsidian, flint, and other knappable materials have distinct origins. In a connected world, these materials can travel far through successive handoffs, not carried across the entire land by one person, but moving gradually, region by region. Archaeology already shows this kind of movement in fragmented landscapes. Stone tools made from materials sourced hundreds of kilometers away appear in sites far from their origin. On a supercontinent, with fewer barriers, this movement could be even more extensive. The same applies to organic materials, shells from inland seas, feathers from specific bird species, pigments from mineral deposits. These items might be valued for their properties, their appearance, or the stories attached to them. Their movement creates invisible networks connecting distant regions. These networks are not centrally planned. They emerge organically from repeated contact. A group known for access to a certain resource becomes a point of connection. Others seek them out or encounter them along shared routes. Over time, expectations form. If you meet people from this direction, they may have this material. If you bring this item, it may be valued elsewhere. Journeys without borders also mean that routes are flexible. There is no single trade road that must be defended or maintained. Instead, there are many overlapping paths, shifting with seasons, climate, and social relationships. When one route becomes difficult, another is found. This flexibility reduces the stakes of any single connection. No one controls trade entirely. No region becomes indispensable. Power remains diffuse. Exchange is resilient because it is not dependent on narrow corridors. Travel itself is not framed as crossing into foreign territory. It is framed as moving through familiar but varied land. This changes the psychology of journeying. Fear exists, but it is tempered by recognition. The land ahead may be challenging, but it is still land. The people ahead may be different, but they are still people. This encourages exploration without conquest. There is less incentive to dominate because movement provides alternatives. If a region is hostile, it can often be bypassed. If resources are scarce, another route may offer relief. Journeys also carry information. News travels with people. Knowledge of weather patterns, reports of animal migrations, warnings about disease or danger. These messages spread along the same paths as materials. In a connected world, information can travel faster than people themselves. A story passed from group to group can cover great distances in a relatively short time, even if no one travels the full route. This creates a shared awareness that extends beyond immediate surroundings. Such awareness supports cooperation. Groups know what lies ahead. They can prepare. They can avoid mistakes others have made. This reduces uncertainty and increases the efficiency of movement. Trade without oceans also delays certain kinds of specialization. In fragmented worlds, coastal communities often specialize early in maritime trade. Inland communities specialize differently. On a supercontinent, specialization still occurs, but it is less rigid. A group may be known for a particular skill, such as tool-making, hunting a specific animal, or knowledge of a difficult terrain. But these roles are not exclusive. Others can learn them. Knowledge spreads rather than being guarded. This openness shapes values. Generosity is rewarded because it strengthens networks. Hoarding knowledge weakens relationships and invites isolation. Social standing grows from usefulness rather than accumulation. Journeys without borders also affect how distance is perceived socially. Someone from far away is not necessarily foreign in a categorical sense. They are simply someone who has travelled a long way. Their difference is measured in stories rather than in threat. This reduces the impulse to define rigid in-groups and out-groups. Identity remains flexible. Belonging can be negotiated through behaviour rather than ancestry alone. Marriage, for example, becomes a form of exchange, not transactional, but connective. Partnerships between groups strengthen relationships. Knowledge and genes flow along the same paths. This biological exchange mirrors cultural exchange, reinforcing continuity. On a supercontinent, such connections can extend over vast areas without becoming strained. There is always another group between any two distant points. Distance is bridged incrementally. This incremental bridging matters. It prevents sudden shocks. New ideas arrive gradually. New materials become familiar before they become essential. Adaptation has time to occur. When we think of trade today, we often think of volume and speed. Goods moving rapidly across oceans. On Pangaea, trade would be slow but deep. Objects might take generations to travel far, but along the way they would gather meaning. An object from afar would not be anonymous. Its origin would be known through story. Who made it? Where it came from? Why it was valued? This narrative travels with the object, adding to its significance. This narrative dimension of trade reinforces memory. Objects become anchors for stories. Stories become vehicles for knowledge. Knowledge strengthens survival. Journeys without borders also mean that exploration does not require radical innovation. No ships need to be built. No navigation across featureless expanses is required. The land itself guides movement through rivers, valleys, and animal trails. This guidance reduces risk. People can learn routes through observation and repetition. They can retreat if conditions worsen. They are rarely committed irreversibly to a path. This contrasts sharply with ocean travel, where commitment is total. Once at sea, turning back is not always possible. This difference has psychological consequences. Land travel encourages cautious curiosity. Sea travel encourages decisive risk. In a supercontinent world, cautious curiosity dominates. Exploration proceeds in small steps. Each step builds confidence. Each success encourages further movement. Over time, this produces an extensive web of routes, known to different degrees by different groups. No one knows everything, but everyone knows something useful. As Pangaea begins to fragment, these systems come under pressure. Routes are interrupted by rising water. Familiar paths vanish. Exchange slows. Some networks break. Others adapt by developing new technologies, such as boats. But before that fragmentation becomes decisive, trade without oceans creates a world that is socially wide, even if technologically simple. The land itself is the infrastructure. Journeys without borders also shape storytelling. Tales of distant places do not sound fantastical. They sound achievable. Someone you know has been there. Someone else met someone who came from there. Distance is impressive, but not magical. This grounding keeps imagination tethered to reality. Myths draw from shared landscapes rather than unreachable realms. Even the idea of the unknown remains connected to the known. Over generations, this builds a sense of the world as continuous and navigable. There is always more land, more people, more variation, but it all fits within a single frame of understanding. This does not eliminate conflict or misunderstanding. It does reduce the tendency to see difference as absolute. Difference becomes expected, even interesting. Trade without oceans is not about accumulation. It is about circulation. Journeys without borders are not about escape. They are about continuity. When oceans eventually impose borders, humanity adapts. Trade becomes more formal. Journeys become more perilous. Borders acquire meaning. But the habits formed earlier do not disappear entirely. The instinct to exchange, the desire to travel, the ability to recognize value in unfamiliar forms. These traits persist, shaped by earlier conditions. Even now, when oceans divide us, trade still relies on trust built across distance. Journeys still carry stories as much as goods. Cultural exchange still softens boundaries where it is allowed to occur. These are echoes of a time when the land itself made exchange easier, when walking was enough, when borders were not lines to cross, but changes to notice. Long before stories were written down, before symbols were carved into stone or ink pressed onto fibre, stories lived where people lived. They moved when people moved. They changed as voices changed, and above all they gathered beneath the same sky. On a single, continuous land, Myths, stars and stories did not belong to isolated regions. They belonged to patterns shared across distance, shaped by observation, memory, and the quiet human need to make sense of a world that was vast, demanding, and often unpredictable. The sky was the most stable feature of life on Pangaea. The ground shifted slowly, rivers changed course, forests expanded and retreated. But the stars returned night after night in dependable arrangements. For early humans, this consistency mattered. When everything else was subject to change, the sky offered reliability. It did not promise safety, but it promised order. Looking upward was not an act of philosophy. It was practical. The movement of the sun marked time. The moon influenced tides and animal behaviour. The stars offered direction. In a landscape without roads or borders, orientation depended on the heavens. Knowing where you were often meant knowing where the stars were. Under one sky, these observations spread. People in different regions noticed the same patterns, though from slightly different angles. A group travelling north or south would see certain stars rise higher or sink lower. Over time, these variations became part of shared knowledge. Stories explained why some stars changed position, why others never moved, why certain constellations appeared only in certain seasons. These explanations were not scientific in the modern sense, but they were systematic. They linked observation to meaning. A cluster of stars rising just before dawn might signal the return of rains. Another appearing at dusk might warn of approaching cold. Stories preserved these associations long after the original observations were forgotten. On a connected landmass, these stories travelled with people. A narrative tied to a star did not stop at a coastline. It followed migration routes. It adapted to local language and environment, but its core structure remained. The same sky encouraged the same questions. The same questions encouraged similar answers. This is why myths across distant cultures often resemble one another, not because they copied directly, but because they grew in contact. On Pangaea, contact was gradual but persistent. A story told in one place might reach another over generations, reshaped slightly at each telling, yet still recognizable. The night sky also provided a canvas for memory. Without writing, memory must be anchored. The stars offer fixed reference points. A story attached to a constellation becomes easier to remember because the constellation returns predictably. The sky becomes a mnemonic device, reinforcing cultural continuity. This relationship between story and sky creates a shared temporal framework. Time is no longer just counted in days or seasons, but in celestial cycles. When this star returns, we do this. When that constellation disappears, we prepare for something else. Rituals align with astronomy not out of superstition, but because the sky is the most reliable calendar available. On a supercontinent, this alignment could extend across enormous distances. Groups separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometres might still recognise the same seasonal markers. Their rituals would not be identical, but they would resonate. This resonance reinforces a sense of belonging to a larger world, even without direct contact. Stories also served another purpose. They explained the unfamiliar. On a land that stretches endlessly, people encounter new environments regularly. New animals, new plants, new weather patterns. Stories provide a way to integrate these experiences into existing understanding. A strange animal becomes a character in a tale. A dangerous place becomes associated with a spirit or warning figure. These narratives encode caution. They travel faster than direct experience. Someone who has never been to a certain region may still know to avoid it at certain times because of a story. This function of myth is often underestimated. Myths are not merely symbolic. They are instructional. They compress complex environmental knowledge into memorable forms. On a supercontinent where routes and hazards repeat across space, such compression is invaluable. Under one sky, stories also help manage fear. The land is large, night is dark, storms are powerful. The stars offer a sense of scale that is both humbling and comforting. Stories explain why thunder comes, why eclipses occur, why certain nights feel different. These explanations reduce anxiety. They turn unpredictable events into expected ones. Even when the explanation is not accurate by modern standards, it provides psychological stability. That stability supports cooperation and decision-making. Children grow up learning these stories early. They absorb not just the narrative but the values embedded within it. Respect for the land, attention to cycles, caution in unfamiliar situations, generosity toward others. These lessons are reinforced every time the sky repeats itself. On a connected landmass, storytelling styles themselves become shared. Certain narrative structures persist, a beginning that situates the listener, a sequence of events tied to action and consequence, an ending that reinforces memory without closing off meaning entirely. These structures are effective because they mirror lived experience. The sky also influences how people imagine origin and destiny. Without sharp geographical divisions, origin stories are less likely to be tied to a single sacred place. Instead, they may describe emergence from the land itself, from the sky, from movement, from ancestors who walked long paths. This mobility shapes myth. Heroes travel, creators wander. Lessons are learned through journeys rather than static events. This reflects a world where movement is normal rather than exceptional. Even ideas of the afterlife may reflect this. Death might be imagined as a journey rather than a destination, a crossing beneath the same stars, a continuation rather than an end. These ideas align with a worldview shaped by walking, by gradual change, by continuity. The shared sky also limits divergence. While stories adapt locally, they cannot drift too far without losing coherence. The stars act as anchors. A story about a particular constellation must still align with its visible form. This constrains imagination in a way that supports consistency. As a result, myths across a connected world may differ in detail but align in structure. Similar archetypes appear: sky beings, tricksters, travellers, cycles of loss and return. These are not random. They reflect shared environmental and cognitive pressures. The absence of oceans also affects how the unknown is imagined. In fragmented worlds, the unknown often lies beyond water, associated with mystery or danger. On Pangaea, the unknown lies over land. It is approachable. It can be reached eventually. This changes the tone of myth. Rather than unreachable realms, myths describe distant but attainable places. Challenges exist, but they are navigable. The world feels large but not closed. This fosters curiosity rather than dread. As continents begin to drift apart, this dynamic changes. The sky remains shared, but the land does not. Stories begin to anchor more tightly to place. Origins become localized. Distant lands become abstract or mythical rather than familiar. But even then, the sky continues to connect. People on opposite sides of oceans still see many of the same stars. Old stories persist, adapted to new contexts. The memory of shared observation lingers. This persistence explains why astronomical myths often show remarkable similarity across cultures separated by vast distances. These same constellations inspire similar narratives. The same cycles prompt similar rituals. These similarities are not coincidences. They are echoes of a time when the land allowed stories to travel freely beneath a shared sky. Storytelling also reinforces social bonds. Around fires at night, people recount experiences, successes, mistakes, encounters. These stories teach without lecturing. They allow listeners to learn indirectly. This is especially important in a world where mistakes can be fatal. On a supercontinent, where people encounter many different environments, storytelling becomes a way to transmit second-hand experience. You may never have crossed a certain desert, but you know what it demands because someone else has told you. This accumulation of shared narrative creates a collective intelligence that extends beyond individual experience. The group knows more than any one person. This knowledge travels with the group, adapting as needed. The stars play a subtle role here as well. They provide continuity across generations. A grandparent and child look up at the same sky. Stories told once can be retold years later under the same patterns. This reinforces identity across time. As the land fractures, this continuity becomes harder to maintain. Different skies appear in different latitudes. Certain stars disappear from view. Stories tied to them lose relevance. New stories emerge. But the habit of looking up remains. Humans continue to search the sky for meaning, direction, and reassurance. This habit was formed early, under conditions that encourage shared observation. Myths, stars, and stories under one sky are not separate domains. They are interwoven responses to a world that demanded attention, memory, and cooperation. The sky offered order. Stories offered meaning. Together, they supported survival. In imagining this lost age, it's important not to idolize it. Life was difficult. Knowledge was incomplete. Fear was real. But there was coherence. The world made sense enough to navigate. That coherence did not come from dominance or certainty. It came from repetition, from shared experience, from the steady return of stars and seasons. Even now, when we hear myths from cultures far removed from our own, something often feels familiar, not because the details match, but because the structure does, because the questions are the same. Those shared questions were asked under one sky, on one land, long before names for continents existed. And the answers, imperfect but meaningful, travelled as far as people could walk, settling into memory, carried forward through time, still visible in the stories we tell when we look up at the stars and wonder how long they have been watching us in return. At first, nothing dramatic happens. No cracks open suddenly beneath people's feet. No walls of water rush in overnight. When the ground begins to drift apart, it does so in a way that is almost insulting in its subtlety. It asks for patience. It hides its intentions. It changes the world slowly enough that no single generation can fully grasp what is unfolding. The Earth does not announce its movements. It murmurs them. On a supercontinent, the earliest signs of separation would not look like disaster. They would look like inconvenience. A river that behaves differently than it used to. A valley that floods more often. A familiar route that becomes marshy and unreliable. The land is still there, still walkable, still continuous, but something about it feels less dependable than before. For people living on that land, this kind of change is unsettling, precisely because it does not demand immediate response. There is no single moment that forces relocation or reinvention. Instead, small adjustments accumulate. Camps shift slightly uphill, travel takes longer, certain seasonal paths are avoided more often. What was once predictable becomes conditional. Deep beneath the surface, tectonic forces are at work. Heat builds under the thick crust of the supercontinent. Mantle currents push upward. The land begins to stretch. When it stretches far enough, it thins. When it thins, it weakens. Eventually it cracks. But long before visible cracks appear, the surface starts behaving differently. Rift zones form quietly. The ground sinks in long, shallow depressions. Lakes appear where none existed before. These lakes may be fresh at first, fed by rivers and rainfall. Over time, as they deepen and connect to the sea, they become saltier. The air nearby grows more humid. Weather patterns shift. For early humans, these changes alter daily life without immediately threatening it. Water becomes more abundant in some areas. Vegetation changes. New animals appear. Other species retreat. What looks like opportunity at first slowly becomes complexity. Movement, once straightforward, now requires decision. Do you cross the flooded lowland, risking unstable ground? Do you detour around it, adding days to the journey? Do you stay longer in one place and wait for conditions to change? These choices matter. They begin to shape habits. As rifts widen, rivers are redirected. Some grow longer, others disappear into new basins. Water that once flowed reliably toward known destinations now pools unpredictably. This disrupts migration patterns, both human and animal. Herds hesitate, routes fracture, timing becomes harder to predict. For societies that rely on seasonal movement, uncertainty is dangerous. Knowledge built over generations becomes less reliable. Elders remember how things used to be, but younger members experience a different reality. This creates tension between memory and observation. At the same time, new environments form, wetlands appear, fresh ecosystems emerge along rift valleys, fish populate newly formed lakes. Plant life adapts quickly to these conditions. For groups willing to experiment, these areas offer resources that did not exist before. So the drifting ground does not only take away, it also creates. This dual nature of change complicates response. Some groups may see opportunity and settle near these new features. Others may avoid them, clinging to older roots. Over time, these choices lead to divergence. Where movement once connected everyone loosely, it now begins to funnel. Certain paths become favoured because they remain passable. Others fade from use. Contact between distant groups becomes less frequent, not because anyone chooses isolation, but because the land no longer supports effortless connection. This is the beginning of fragmentation, not just of geography, but of experience. As rifts deepen, the climate responds. New bodies of water influence rainfall. Winds shift. Areas that were once dry receive moisture. Others dry further as weather patterns reorganize. These changes are uneven. Some regions become more hospitable. Others become harsher. Groups living through this period must adapt unevenly as well. Survival strategies that worked reliably for generations may suddenly fail. A plant that once fruited every year now does so irregularly. An animal migration arrives late or not at all. In response, humans do what they have always done. They observe, they experiment, they share what works. But now, sharing becomes harder. Distance has not increased dramatically yet, but reliability has decreased. A message carried along an old route may not reach its destination. A group expected to arrive does not. Stories no longer align perfectly with experience. This erosion of shared expectation is subtle, but profound. Over time, the rift valleys widen further. The ground sinks more noticeably. Water from the surrounding ocean begins to intrude. At first, this may happen through narrow channels or seasonal flooding. Then, more persistently, salinity changes ecosystems. Freshwater species disappear. New marine life arrives. At this point, the land is still technically connected but psychologically divided. Crossing these regions becomes risky. People hesitate. Detours become permanent. The idea of the other side begins to form even if it is still reachable. This is a critical moment. When the land was fully continuous, distance was a matter of effort. Now, distance becomes a matter of risk. That shift changes behaviour more than any physical measurement. Groups begin to define themselves more strongly by where they stay rather than where they travel. Settlement becomes more attractive. Staying put allows deeper familiarity with a changing local environment. Movement becomes selective rather than routine. This is not yet agriculture or urbanisation, but it is a step toward place-based identity. As connections weaken, cultural drift accelerates. Language shifts faster. Tool styles diverge. Rituals adapt to local conditions without reinforcement from afar. Practices once shared across wide areas now develop independently. None of this is intentional. It is the natural result of reduced contact. When seas finally form, the change feels sudden in retrospect. even though it has been building for millennia. What was once a broad, difficult lowland becomes a body of water that cannot be crossed on foot. Familiar land disappears beneath waves. Routes end abruptly. For the people living through this, the loss is not abstract. It is personal. Places remembered from childhood vanish. Stories no longer match the landscape. Elders describe journeys that are no longer possible. The psychological impact of this separation cannot be overstated. For countless generations, movement was the default solution to environmental pressure. Now movement fails. The land itself says no. This forces innovation. Some groups retreat from the new coastlines and focus inward. They develop deeper knowledge of a smaller area. They invest in long-term strategies. Storage, shelter, and eventually cultivation become more important. Others experiment with crossing water. At first, these crossings are short. Narrow channels, calm conditions, rafts, logs, simple boats. Success is rare at first, but when it happens, it opens new possibilities. The emergence of water as a barrier also creates asymmetry. Crossing it is optional, but dangerous. Those who master it gain access to new resources and contacts. Those who do not become more isolated. This asymmetry accelerates cultural differentiation. What was once a shared world now becomes a collection of related but increasingly distinct worlds. Memory stretches across water, but experience does not. Stories of the far side become more mythical. Knowledge becomes less verifiable. Myths adapt accordingly. Where once they described journeys that could be repeated, they now describe lost lands, submerged paths, and ancestors who walked where water now lies. These are not inventions. They are memory transformed by geography. The ground drifting apart also alters how time is perceived. When change is slow and continuous, time feels cyclical. When change removes familiar features permanently, time feels directional. There is a before and an after. This directional sense of time encourages preservation. Writing, symbols, and durable monuments become more appealing as ways to hold on to knowledge that movement can no longer maintain. Social structures adapt as well. Leadership becomes more localized. Authority is tied to land management rather than navigation. Knowledge of boundaries becomes as important as knowledge of routes. Conflict changes character. When movement was easy, avoidance was an option. Now competition over limited resources intensifies. Defense becomes relevant. Territorial thinking emerges gradually. None of this means humanity becomes less cooperative. Cooperation simply shifts scale. It focuses more on internal cohesion than external connection. Importantly, the sky remains unchanged. Stars still rise and set. The sun still marks seasons. This continuity provides psychological grounding amid geographic upheaval. People still recognize the heavens even when the land no longer matches memory. This contrast between stable sky and shifting ground deepens symbolic thinking. The heavens come to represent permanence. The earth represents change. This duality appears in later cosmologies across the world. As continents continue to drift, the process repeats at different scales. New separations form, new adaptations follow. Humanity becomes increasingly skilled at living in fragmented environments. But that skill is built on earlier habits formed when the land was whole. The ability to adapt, to share knowledge, to read subtle environmental cues, to respond to gradual change. What happens when the ground begins to drift apart is not a collapse. It is a redirection. The strategies that once favoured movement now favour memory. The networks that once spanned land now compress into regions. The shared world does not disappear. It becomes layered, with echoes preserved in language, myth, and instinct. Even today, humans feel the pull of lost connection. We imagine land bridges. We search for submerged worlds. We tell stories of ancient unity. These impulses are not fantasies. They are responses to a deep shift in how the earth itself organizes life. The ground drifting apart teaches humanity a new lesson. That continuity is not guaranteed. That adaptation must now work within limits rather than across openness. That connection requires effort where it once required only time. When civilizations are pulled away by a moving Earth, the separation does not begin with ships or walls or declared borders. It begins with silence, with distance increasing so gradually that no one can point to the exact moment when connection became absence. What was once a familiar route becomes a memory. What was once a shared rhythm becomes a local habit. The Earth does not tear civilizations apart violently. It stretches them until they no longer touch. By the time we can clearly identify separate civilizations in the archaeological record, the pulling has already been underway for a very long time. As land masses drift, the first thing to weaken is not trade or language, but expectation. For countless generations, people expected that movement would eventually reconnect them to others. Even if journeys were long or difficult, there was confidence that land continued beyond the horizon. When that expectation fails repeatedly, behaviour changes. A group waits for others who never arrive. A seasonal gathering does not happen. A message sent along an old route does not return. At first, these feel like accidents, bad timing, harsh seasons, illness. Over time, they begin to feel structural. This is how civilizations begin to pull apart psychologically before they ever do geographically. Once oceans intrude decisively, the separation becomes unavoidable. Land that once connected regions sinks beneath water. The distance that must be crossed is no longer measured in days or weeks of walking, but in the ability to survive a fundamentally different environment. Water is not just another terrain. It demands new skills, new tools, and a different relationship with risk. Not everyone adapts at the same pace. Some populations live near emerging coastlines and interact with water regularly. For them, experimentation begins earlier. Short crossings, fishing techniques, floating platforms. Others live far inland where the sea is a rumour rather than a presence. For them, separation feels final long before it technically is. This uneven exposure creates uneven futures. Groups that develop maritime skills maintain broader connections longer. Those that do not become increasingly local. Over time, this difference compounds. Knowledge spreads faster among connected coastal groups. Isolation deepens inland. Civilization, as we later recognize it, emerges unevenly across these diverging paths. It is important to recognize that early civilizations are not born fully formed. Their responses to constraint. When movement across land was easy, there was little incentive to build permanent structures, accumulate surplus, or formalize hierarchy. Mobility solved many problems that organization would later address. As the Earth pulls land apart, mobility loses that power. When movement no longer guarantees access to resources or safety, people invest more deeply in place. They begin to modify land intensively rather than move across it lightly. Storage becomes critical. Ownership emerges. Boundaries are defended because leaving is no longer a reliable option. This is the soil from which civilizations grow. But because the pulling happens differently in different places, civilizations emerge with distinct characters. A civilization shaped by fertile river valleys behaves differently than one shaped by arid plains or fragmented coastlines. Geography does not determine culture outright, but it applies pressure that rewards certain solutions over others. Once land separates, civilizations begin solving similar problems independently. How to manage water, how to coordinate labour, how to transmit knowledge reliably, how to legitimize authority. These problems have overlapping solutions, which is why early civilizations across the world share structural similarities despite lacking direct contact. Writing emerges not because humans suddenly become symbolic thinkers, but because memory alone is no longer enough. When knowledge cannot travel easily with people, it must be fixed in durable form. Writing externalizes memory. Architecture emerges not because people suddenly want monuments, but because investment in place becomes worthwhile. If you are staying, you build. If you are building, you plan long term. Law emerges not because people suddenly become moral, but because disputes cannot be resolved by simple separation. When groups cannot walk away, rules must be negotiated. All of these developments are responses to separation imposed by geography. As continents drift farther apart, civilizations that once shared deep common ancestry begin to forget that connection. Myths change. Origin stories localize. Shared ancestors become symbolic rather than remembered. Over generations, the idea that people elsewhere are fundamentally different takes hold. Yet traces of shared origin persist. Architectural patterns echo across continents. Similar agricultural practices arise in different regions. Symbolic motifs recur. These similarities are often explained as coincidence or universal psychology, but geography tells another part of the story. They are the residue of a long period of connection followed by gradual separation. Civilizations pulled away by moving Earth do not lose everything at once. They lose redundancy first. When one region innovates, others no longer benefit automatically. Knowledge becomes local. Innovation must be reinvented elsewhere or arrive much later. This slows progress in some areas while accelerating it in others. Regions with favourable conditions advance rapidly. Others stagnate or adapt in different directions. The global human story becomes uneven. Conflict also changes character. When movement was possible, conflict could often be avoided. When separation fixes populations in place, conflict becomes more intense. Resources are finite, land is defended, power concentrates. This concentration leads to hierarchy. Leadership becomes institutional rather than situational. Authority is tied to control of resources rather than knowledge of roots. This is a profound shift in social logic. At the same time, cooperation within groups intensifies. Large-scale projects become possible. Irrigation systems, defensive structures, shared rituals. Civilization trades flexibility for stability. Not all groups make this trade at the same time or in the same way. Some remain mobile longer, adapting to fragmented landscapes through navigation and trade. Others settle early and deeply, becoming highly structured societies. The moving Earth creates a diversity of human trajectories. It is tempting to see this as progress or decline, but it is more accurate to see it as specialization. Humanity learns to live under new constraints. Skills once essential become optional. New skills become critical. Navigation across water replaces navigation across land. Storage replaces movement. Written contracts replace oral agreement. Memory shifts from people to objects. Yet beneath these changes, older instincts remain. The desire to connect, the tendency to trade, the habit of storytelling. These behaviours adapt rather than disappear. Even civilizations that appear isolated often retain myths of distant lands, lost connections, or ancestors who came from elsewhere. These are not inventions. They are compressed memories of a world that once allowed easier contact. The Earth's movement also reshapes time perception. Civilizations begin marking years, reigns, and eras more explicitly. When the land changes slowly but irreversibly, humans begin tracking change consciously. History becomes something to record rather than simply remember. This recording reinforces identity. A civilization defines itself through continuity across generations, rather than through movement across space. This inward focus strengthens cultural coherence while reducing external familiarity. As oceans widen, the effort required to maintain contact increases dramatically. A failed sea journey can be fatal. The cost of experimentation rises. Many connections simply end, but not all. Some civilizations remain maritime. They hug coastlines, island hop, and preserve fragments of older networks. These societies act as bridges between worlds that would otherwise be entirely separate. Their existence demonstrates that separation is never absolute, only costly. Still, for most of humanity, the pulling apart becomes the defining condition. The world feels larger, but also more divided. Distance becomes meaningful in a new way. Foreignness becomes a category rather than a gradient. Civilizations pulled away by moving Earth begin to see themselves as unique rather than connected. This uniqueness becomes a source of pride, identity, and sometimes conflict. Yet the similarities persist beneath the surface. Humans everywhere organize, imagine, and remember in ways shaped by shared deep history. The divergence is real, but it is layered on top of common foundations. From a deep time perspective, civilizations are not separate experiments. They are branches of a single process responding to changing planetary conditions. The Earth rearranges itself, and humanity rearranges its strategies in response. This reframing matters because it removes the illusion that civilizations rise and fall solely due to internal virtue or failure. They are also shaped by forces far larger than themselves. Moving plates, changing climates, shifting coastlines. Understanding this does not diminish human agency, it contextualizes it. People still make choices, they innovate, cooperate, and compete. But they do so within constraints imposed by a planet that is never truly still. As we look back, it becomes clear that civilization is not the natural state of humanity. It is a response to separation. It emerges when connection becomes difficult enough to require structure. Before that, humanity practiced continuity through movement. After that, it practiced continuity through institutions. Both are adaptive, neither is permanent. Even today, as technology reconnects the world in new ways, the old tension between connection and separation remains. Oceans no longer stop information, but they still shape politics, economics, and identity. The Earth's ancient movements continue to influence modern life. Civilizations pulled away by moving Earth carry forward a memory of unity they can no longer physically access. This memory appears in myths of golden ages, lost lands and shared origins. It appears in the persistent human discomfort with isolation. Even though Pangaea no longer exists as a single land, it has never fully stopped speaking. Its voice is not heard in rock alone, or in the alignment of continents across oceans, but in the quieter places where human memory, imagination, and interpretation overlap. Echoes of Pangaea persist not because people consciously remember it, but because long periods of connection shaped how humans explain the world, draw it, and tell stories about where they came from and how everything fits together. Modern myths often feel fragmented, belonging to specific cultures, regions, or belief systems. Yet when examined carefully, many of them seem to gesture towards something broader. Stories of lost lands, submerged worlds, ancient unions, and primal separations appear across societies that, on the surface, have no reason to share such themes. These are not exact retellings of geological history. They are cultural responses to a deep human experience of continuity followed by loss. Flood myths are one of the clearest examples. From Mesopotamia to South Asia, from indigenous American traditions to Pacific Island cultures, stories describe land swallowed by water, connections erased, and survivors adapting to a changed world. These stories are often treated as metaphor or coincidence, but they may also reflect generational memory of rising seas and vanishing roots. As Pangaea broke apart and later land bridges disappeared, people witnessed coastlines move inward. Paths once walked were submerged. Familiar landscapes transformed into unfamiliar horizons. Such changes would not be remembered as slow tectonic processes. They would be remembered as events, as moments when the land betrayed expectation. Stories compress time. They turn gradual change into narrative. Water arrives, land disappears. Life must adapt. Maps too carry echoes of a unified world. Long before accurate global cartography existed, people drew maps that attempted to show totality rather than precision. Medieval world maps often depict continents arranged around a central landmass, sometimes surrounded by water, sometimes fused in improbable ways. These maps are often dismissed as ignorance, but they may reflect an intuitive sense that the world was once more connected than experience suggested. Even early modern cartographers, working with fragmentary information, noticed how coastlines appeared to fit together. The west coast of Africa and the east coast of South America seemed to mirror each other. Long before plate tectonics was understood, this resemblance prompted speculation. The idea that continents might once have been joined did not emerge suddenly in the 20th century. It lingered quietly in observation and imagination for centuries. This persistence matters because it shows that humans have long sensed continuity beneath separation. Geography was experienced as something that had changed, not something that was eternally fixed. Mountains erode, rivers move, coastlines shift. It is not unreasonable that people would also suspect deeper rearrangements. In myth, this suspicion often appears as a story of original unity, a time when gods and humans lived closer together, when lands were connected, when travel was easier. These stories are not historical records, but they express a felt truth, that the present world is not the only way the world has ever been. The idea of a golden age often overlaps with this sense of unity, a past where abundance was greater, conflict was less rigid, and movement was freer. While such stories can be idealized, they often emerge in societies experiencing increasing constraint. As land becomes divided and resources become localized, the memory of openness gains symbolic power. Language itself preserves these echoes. Words for land, earth, and ground often share roots across distant language families. Directional terms sometimes encode ancient movement patterns. Place names persist even when the places themselves change. A bay named for a river that no longer flows, a mountain named for an animal that no longer lives there. These linguistic fossils are not proof of Pangaea, but they show how memory outlasts geography. Humans are storytellers not just about events, but about space. When space changes, stories adjust, but they rarely disappear entirely. Modern science eventually provided a framework that confirmed what intuition and observation had long suggested. Plate tectonics explained how continents move, how oceans form, how land once united can separate. This discovery did not invent the idea of unity. It explained it. What is striking is how readily the idea was accepted once evidence accumulated. The fit of continents, the distribution of fossils, the alignment of mountain ranges. These patterns resonated because they aligned with something humans were already prepared to believe, that the Earth has a history of connection and separation. Maps changed accordingly. What was once speculation became accepted fact. Pangaea entered textbooks, diagrams, and public imagination. Yet even now, it often feels abstract, a scientific model rather than a lived world. That abstraction hides how deeply the concept aligns with older ways of thinking. The sense that the Earth is dynamic, that land can move, that separation is temporary on geological scales. These ideas are not foreign to myth, they are native to it. Modern fantasy literature often revisits these themes unconsciously. Stories of worlds breaking apart, continents drifting, lands sinking beneath the sea, characters crossing remnants of ancient bridges. These narratives resonate because they echo a deep pattern. Unity lost, separation endured, connection sought again. Even the way we imagine the future reflects this. Visions of reunification through technology, global connectivity, the shrinking of distance. These are not just technological fantasies. They are emotional responses to separation, a desire to restore continuity by other means. In maps, echoes of Pangaea appear subtly in how we still orient ourselves. North at the top, centered projections, attempts to show the whole world at once despite distortion. We want to see everything together. We resist fragmentation visually even when it is geographically accurate. Some map projections exaggerate connections, others minimize oceans. Choices about representation reveal priorities. What we choose to emphasize reflects what we value: continuity or division, proximity or distance. Even the term Old World and New World implies a narrative of separation and rediscovery. These categories carry emotional weight beyond geography. They suggest that parts of the world were once known, then lost, then found again. This language mirrors deeper patterns of memory and forgetting. In popular culture, the idea of ancient advanced civilizations lost to time often appears. While many such claims lack evidence, their persistence is revealing. People are drawn to the idea that something significant existed before fragmentation. That knowledge or connection was lost when the world changed. This does not mean those civilizations existed as imagined. It means that the experience of loss is real. Geography changed, roots vanished, contacts ended, human memory filled the gaps with story. Even scientific diagrams of Pangaea often provoke a sense of familiarity. People remark that it makes sense, that the continents look like they belong together. This reaction is not purely rational, it is intuitive. That intuition may arise because humans evolved in environments where continuity was the norm, where land connected rather than divided. Even though Pangaea itself predates humanity, its later remnants and land bridges shaped early human experience. The brain expects connection because it learned under connected conditions. Modern myths and maps are therefore not just reflections of knowledge, they are reflections of expectation. As continents drifted apart, humans adapted. They built ships, they learned navigation, they developed ways to reconnect across water. But the desire to connect remained rooted in earlier habits. Water became a challenge to overcome, not a natural boundary to accept. This is why maritime exploration carries such symbolic weight. Crossing oceans is celebrated because it defies separation. It restores contact where geology imposed distance. Even now, when technology allows instant communication, physical separation still matters emotionally. We speak of bridging gaps, of closing distances, of reconnecting the world. These metaphors are revealing. They suggest that separation is experienced as a problem to solve, not a neutral condition. Echoes of Pangaea persist in how humans imagine wholeness, in how they resist fragmentation, in how they interpret patterns across space. They also persist in scientific curiosity. The study of paleogeography is not just technical. It answers a question humans have asked intuitively for a long time. How did the world become this way? Understanding Pangaea provides more than an answer. It provides context. It situates humanity within a longer story of connection and separation that predates us, and will continue long after us. When modern people look at maps showing ancient supercontinents, they often feel a quiet sense of loss or wonder. Not because they lived there, but because the idea resonates with deep cognitive patterns shaped by movement, continuity, and shared space. Myths preserve emotional truth. Maps preserve structural truth. Together, they tell a story that neither could tell alone. The story is not that everything was better when land was won. It is that unity shaped how life learned to connect. Separation reshaped how life learned to remember. As we approach the end of this exploration, that distinction becomes important. Pangaea itself is gone, but the habits it fostered remain visible in how humans think, narrate, and represent the world. We still search for patterns that connect distant places. We still feel that the Earth fits together somehow, even when water divides it. We still tell stories of lost unity and future reconnection. These are not errors, they are echoes. Echoes of a world that once allowed connection by default. A world whose slow division taught humanity how to cope with distance, but never quite erased the desire to overcome it. Remembering a world that still lives beneath our feet does not require imagination so much as attention. The land we stand on has not forgotten where it came from. It carries memory in its fractures, in the way mountain ranges align across oceans, in the way coastlines seem to reach for one another across water. Long after Pangaea ceased to exist as a single surface, it remained present as structure, as pressure, as tendency. And humanity, whether consciously or not, has always lived in conversation with that buried past. The Earth does not reset itself when continents separate, it rearranges. Old connections become hidden rather than erased. Plates slide, but they do not dissolve. The same crust that once formed continuous ground now lies beneath seas, carrying the same composition, the same scars, the same deep logic. When we drill into the ocean floor or study seismic waves travelling through the planet, we're not uncovering something new. We're listening to something old. From a human perspective, this matters because our relationship with land has always been layered. We live on the surface, but we respond to what lies beneath. Soil fertility depends on ancient rock. Water flows according to buried structures. Earthquakes and volcanoes remind us that stability is temporary. Even when we forget deep time, it does not forget us. To remember a world that still lives beneath our feet is not to mourn it. It is to recognise that separation and connection are both temporary states. The land we know now is one arrangement among many. It feels permanent because our lives are short. But permanence is an illusion created by scale. Human memory, however, has always strained against that illusion. We tell stories that reach farther back than written history. We speculate about origins. We search for patterns that explain why things are the way they are. This instinct did not emerge recently. It was shaped over tens of thousands of years of living on land that was once more continuous than it is now. Even though Pangaea itself predates humanity, its later echoes shape the conditions under which humanity evolved. Land bridges persisted. Continents were closer. Routes existed that no longer do. The sense that the world was once easier to traverse is not entirely fictional. It is grounded in lived experience passed down through countless generations. When people today imagine ancient unity, they are not imagining something alien. They're responding to inherited expectations about how space behaves. The idea that land should connect rather than divide feels intuitive because, for much of human history, it did. This intuition shapes how we interpret the present. Oceans feel like obstacles rather than features. Borders feel artificial even when they are enforced. Distance feels like a problem to be solved. These reactions are not purely cultural. They are responses formed under different geographic conditions. Even modern technology reflects this impulse. Roads, tunnels, bridges, and communication networks all aim to restore continuity. We dig through mountains, we span water, we compress distance, we recreate in artificial form the connectivity that geology removed. This is not nostalgia, it is adaptation. The world beneath our feet reminds us that the planet is active, not finished. Continents continue to move, new rifts form, old oceans close. Over geological time, the Earth cycles between unity and fragmentation. Pangaea was not the first supercontinent, and it will not be the last. From that perspective, separation is a phase, not a destiny. Human civilization arose during a period of fragmentation, and much of our social structure reflects that. Nations form around bounded land. Identity ties itself to territory. Conflict arises over control of fixed resources. These patterns feel natural now because they are familiar, but they are not universal. Earlier, under conditions of greater connectivity, humanity practiced different solutions. Movement instead of accumulation. Knowledge sharing instead of hoarding. Identity shaped by practice rather than place. These habits did not disappear when continents separated. They adapted, often constrained, sometimes suppressed, but still present. We see them in nomadic cultures, in trade networks that persist across hostile terrain, in diasporas that maintain connection across oceans. in the human ability to feel belonging in multiple places at once. These capacities are remnants of an older relationship with land. To remember the world beneath our feet is also to remember that geology is not background scenery. It is an active participant in history. It shapes what is possible long before humans make decisions. It determines which strategies succeed and which fail. This recognition can be unsettling. It challenges the idea that history is purely the result of human will. But it can also be grounding. It situates humanity within a larger process rather than outside of it. When we acknowledge that civilizations were pulled apart by moving Earth, not solely by choice or conflict, we gain perspective. We see divergence as adaptation rather than failure. We understand similarity as inheritance rather than coincidence. The land beneath our feet also reminds us of humility. Human structures feel permanent until earthquakes erase them. Coastlines feel stable until seas rise. Cities feel anchored until plates shift. The Earth does not oppose humanity, but it does not defer to it either. This humility can inform how we approach the future. Today the planet is changing again, this time under strong human influence. Climate shifts, sea levels rise, habitats move. Once again, humanity faces conditions where movement, adaptation, and cooperation matter. In this sense, remembering Pangaea is not about the past. It is about recognizing recurring patterns. The Earth changes, humans respond. Strategies that once worked may work again in altered form. The memory of connectivity may be especially relevant now. In a world facing fragmentation through political division and environmental stress, the instinct to reconnect becomes important. Not necessarily by restoring land bridges, but by restoring cooperation. The idea that humanity shares deep roots, shaped under shared conditions, can counter narratives of absolute difference. It does not erase diversity, it contextualizes it. Beneath our feet, the Earth still carries the marks of unity. Beneath our cultures, humanity still carries the habits formed under it. When we look at maps of ancient supercontinents, something often feels familiar. Not because we remember them, but because our way of understanding space was shaped by their remnants. We expect things to fit together because once they did. This expectation shows up even in children, who instinctively draw worlds as continuous surfaces rather than fragmented islands. It shows up in language, where metaphors of connection dominate how we describe understanding, agreement and peace, to connect ideas, to bridge gaps, to build common ground. These phrases are not accidental. They reflect a deep association between physical continuity and social harmony. An association formed long before anyone named the continents or oceans. Remembering a world that still lives beneath our feet does not mean longing to return to it. Humanity cannot rewind geology, but it can learn from the conditions that shaped its earliest patterns. It can recognize that adaptability is not weakness, that movement can be a solution, that diversity does not require isolation, that connection does not require sameness. The Earth beneath us continues to move, whether we notice or not. Plates shift by centimetres each year. Stress accumulates. Change is inevitable. The question is not whether the world will change, but how humanity will respond when it does. Looking back at Pangaea provides one answer. Humanity responds by learning, sharing, adjusting, and carrying memory forward. Not perfectly, not without loss, but persistently. Even now, when we dig foundations, we encounter layers of ancient stone formed under different skies. When we hike mountains, we walk on uplifted seabeds. When we cross oceans, we sail over land that once stood above water. The world beneath our feet is not dead history. It is active context. And so, remembering it is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of awareness. Awareness that the ground is not fixed, that separation is temporary, that connection has deep roots. that humanity's story is inseparable from the planet's own restless motion. As this exploration comes to rest, not with an ending but with a pause, it leaves us with a quiet realization. The Earth we inhabit now is one version of a much longer story. The ways we live, speak, travel and imagine are shaped by worlds that no longer exist in visible form, but still exist structurally beneath us, guiding what feels natural and what feels difficult. Pangaea is gone as a place, but not as an influence. It lives in stone, in memory, in instinct, and in the persistent human sense that the world is meant to be understood as a whole, even when it appears divided. And perhaps that sense itself is the deepest echo of all.